Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of WTF Dreams, where we dive into the strangest corners of human consciousness throughout history. Tonight, we're exploring something that'll probably give you chills, the eerie accounts of people who literally dreamed their own deaths before living them out in terrifying detail. So before you settle in for the night, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe if these bizarre historical dream stories actually help you drift off. And I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always fascinating to see how these strange tales reach insomniacs across the globe. Now, get comfortable, dim those lights, and prepare to question everything you think you know about fate, free will, and that thin line between sleeping and waking. And hey, if you end up falling asleep before we're done, well, that's exactly what we're going for here. You know, I've always found it unsettling how some dreams feel more real than reality itself. Tonight we're talking about people who had that feeling and then watched their subconscious predictions play out with documentary precision. Because sometimes your mind knows things your waking consciousness hasn't figured out yet. Death doesn't just happen to you. Sometimes it dreams through you first. Anyway, let's start with what might be the most chilling prophetic death dream in recorded history. So, picture this. It's April 1865, and Abraham Lincoln, the guy who just saved the Union and ended slavery, wakes up in the White House from what he later described as the most vivid and disturbing dream of my life. And we're not talking about some vague nightmare about being chased by Confederate ghosts or stress dreams about Reconstruction policies. Lincoln dreamed his own death in excruciating, almost cinematographic detail. But before we dive into the nightmare that would haunt America's greatest president in his final days, let me paint you a picture of what Lincoln's life was like in those final weeks of April 1865. The man was exhausted. 4 years of civil war had aged him decades. People who knew Lincoln before the war said he looked like a completely different person by 1865. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, with deep lines carved into his face by the weight of sending hundreds of thousands of young men to their deaths. His wife Mary was dealing with her own psychological breakdown after losing their son Willie to typhoid fever in 1862, and the constant threat of assassination attempts had made the White House feel more like a fortress than a home. Lincoln was receiving death threats daily. The Secret Service, which had literally just been created in 1865, was constantly worried about Confederate sympathizers, angry Union soldiers who blamed him for the war's casualties, and political enemies who saw assassination as a legitimate form of political discourse. This was a time when you could pretty much walk into the White House and request a meeting with the president. Security was, let's just say it was less than adequate. So when Lincoln had this dream, it wasn't completely out of left field. The man was living under constant threat. But the specific details of what he saw in his sleep were so precise, so cinematically accurate that it went far beyond normal anxiety dreams. In his dream, Lincoln heard weeping throughout the White House. Not just crying, but that deep, soul-crushing wailing that happens when someone really important dies. He described it as the sound of a nation mourning, which is exactly what would happen just days later. He followed the sound through corridors he knew by heart, past the rooms where he'd made the most important decisions in American history, down to the East Room. Now, the East Room was the largest room in the White House, used for major state functions, receptions, and historically lying in state for deceased presidents. Lincoln knew this room intimately. He'd held countless meetings there, had entertained foreign dignitaries, had probably paced those floors 1,000 times while making decisions that would shape the country's future. But in his dream, the East Room was transformed into something he'd never seen before, but somehow knew was inevitable. The room was draped in black mourning cloth, filled with flowers that he could actually smell in the dream, lilac, roses, the heavy scent of funeral arrangements. Gas lamps cast flickering shadows on the walls, and the room was packed with mourners dressed in the deep black of formal mourning attire. At the center of it all was a coffin, not just any coffin, but an elaborate mahogany casket with silver handles, surrounded by an honor guard of soldiers standing at attention. Lincoln described being able to see every detail, the grain of the wood, The reflection of the gas lamps on the polished surface, even the specific uniforms of the guards. Here's where it gets absolutely bone-chilling. In the dream, Lincoln approached a soldier standing guard, a young man in a Union Army uniform with sergeant's stripes, and asked, "Who is dead in the White House?" The soldier looked him straight in the eye with what Lincoln later described as the saddest expression I have ever seen on a human face, and said, "The president, he was killed by an assassin." But the dream didn't end there. Lincoln described experiencing his own funeral from the perspective of both observer and deceased. He could see his own body lying in the coffin, could hear the specific prayers being said, could even feel the grief of the mourners around him. He described seeing Mary in her mourning dress, his son Robert in his military uniform, cabinet members and politicians he recognized all weeping over his corpse. What made this dream particularly disturbing was how Lincoln experienced it emotionally. He wasn't just watching these events unfold. He was feeling the collective grief of everyone in the room. He described it as being overwhelmed by a sadness so profound that it felt like drowning in an ocean of sorrow. Lincoln woke up in a cold sweat, drenched in perspiration and shaking. Mary later said she'd never seen her husband so disturbed by a dream. He sat on the edge of their bed for nearly an hour, just staring out the window at the pre-dawn darkness, trying to process what he'd experienced. When he finally told Mary about the dream, her reaction was immediate and intense. Mary Todd Lincoln was already dealing with her own psychological issues she'd been having, what we'd now recognize as anxiety attacks and depressive episodes since Willie's death. She'd become obsessed with spiritualism, attending seances and consulting mediums, trying to contact their dead son. Hearing her husband casually describe his prophetic death vision sent her into what witnesses described as near hysteria. "You must not go out," she told him. "You must not attend any public functions." The dream is a warning. But Lincoln, being Lincoln, couldn't just hide in the White House. He had a country to rebuild, a peace to establish, a future to create from the ashes of the bloodiest war in American history. What's really messed up is that Lincoln seemed to know the dream was significant. He spent those final days acting almost resigned, like he was just waiting for his subconscious prophecy to play out. He started putting his affairs in order in ways that seemed unusual, even for a president dealing with post-war reconstruction. He had several long conversations with his secretary John Hay about his legacy, about how he hoped to be remembered, about the future of the country after he was gone. Lincoln also started talking about death more frequently in his conversations with cabinet members and friends. People noticed that he seemed preoccupied with mortality, that he would sometimes zone out during meetings as if he was thinking about something else entirely. Ward Hill Lamont, his friend and bodyguard, later wrote that Lincoln seemed to be preparing for something he knew was coming but couldn't prevent. The really eerie part is that Lincoln had additional dreams in the days following the initial vision. He told Mary about seeing the White House draped in black mourning cloth, about hearing church bells tolling throughout Washington, about watching his own funeral procession down Pennsylvania Avenue. Each subsequent dream added more specific details that would later prove to be unnaturally accurate. On April 14, 1865, Lincoln hesitated about going to Ford's Theater. He'd been invited to attend a performance of Our American Cousin, a popular comedy that was supposed to be a light, entertaining evening after years of war and political stress. But Lincoln spent most of that day in an unusually melancholy mood, talking to Mary about his dreams and expressing reluctance to go out in public. Mary had to convince him to attend the play. She argued that the American people needed to see their president enjoying normal peacetime activities, that it would be good for national morale to show that the war was truly over and life could return to normal. Lincoln finally agreed, but witnesses said he seemed distracted and anxious throughout the day. What's particularly tragic is that Lincoln's security detail was minimal that night. John Parker, the policeman assigned to guard the president's box at Ford's Theater, abandoned his post during the performance to go get a drink at a nearby saloon. If Parker had stayed at his post, John Wilkes Booth would never have been able to enter the presidential box undetected. But maybe that's exactly what Lincoln's dream was trying to tell him. that no amount of security or precaution could prevent what was destined to happen. Maybe the dream wasn't a warning to be heeded, but a preparation for an inevitable event. During the performance, Lincoln seemed to be enjoying himself more than he had in weeks. Witnesses said he was laughing at the comedy, holding Mary's hand, and appeared more relaxed than anyone had seen him since the war ended. It was as if, having accepted his fate through his prophetic dreams, he was finally able to find some peace. At 10:15 p.m., during the play's third act, John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head with a single-shot Derringer. Lincoln never regained consciousness and died early the next morning, April 15, 1865. The aftermath played out exactly as Lincoln had dreamed. The White House was draped in black mourning cloth. The East Room was transformed into a funeral parlor with Lincoln's body lying in state in an elaborate mahogany coffin with silver handles. Mourners dressed in black filled the room, and the collective grief was so overwhelming that several people fainted during the viewing. Mary Lincoln, already devastated by her husband's death, was further traumatized by how accurately his dreams had predicted every detail of his funeral. She later told friends that living through Abraham's funeral felt like reliving his prophetic dream, as if she was experiencing the same event twice, once in his nightmare and once in horrible reality. The really haunting part is that Lincoln's dreams had included details that no one could have reasonably predicted. He'd seen the specific flowers that would be used in the funeral arrangements, the exact positioning of the honor guard, even the particular hymns that would be sung during the service. These weren't details that could be guessed based on general knowledge of presidential funerals. They were specific choices made by the funeral planners after Lincoln's death. Abraham Lincoln died exactly as he'd dreamed, down to the location of the wound and the sequence of events that followed. His prophetic dreams had given him a preview of not just his death, but of how the entire nation would mourn his passing. What makes Lincoln's story particularly unsettling is that he seemed to understand that his dream wasn't just a personal vision, it was a glimpse into a pivotal moment in American history. He told Mary that in his dreams, he could feel the weight of the nation's grief, could sense that his death would somehow be important for the country's future. And maybe that's exactly what happened. Lincoln's assassination transformed him from a controversial wartime president into a martyred symbol of American unity and freedom. His death allowed the country to grieve the Civil War's casualties while simultaneously celebrating the end of slavery and the preservation of the Union. Sometimes I wonder if Lincoln could have changed the outcome if he'd taken his dream more seriously. If he'd stayed home that night, if he'd increased his security detail. But then again, maybe some dreams aren't warnings, they're just previews of destiny unfolding exactly as it's meant to. Dreams don't just happen to you, sometimes they happen through you, showing you not just your personal fate, but your role in the larger story of history itself. Now here's a story that'll make you question everything you think you know about premonitions and maritime disasters. Colin MacDonald was a 28-year-old engineer from a small fishing village in Scotland who'd been selected to work on the maiden voyage of the Titanic, basically the opportunity of a lifetime in 1912. Picture this guy. Colin had grown up around boats his entire life. His father was a fisherman. His grandfather had worked on merchant vessels. And Colin himself had been fascinated by steam engines since he was old enough to hold a wrench. When he got the job offer to work as a junior engineer on the Titanic, it was like winning the lottery and getting accepted to Harvard at the same time. The Titanic wasn't just any ship, it was being marketed as literally unsinkable. The press was calling it a floating palace, the ship of dreams, the greatest achievement in maritime engineering history. For a working-class guy like Colin, the chance to be part of the maiden voyage was the kind of opportunity that could set up his entire career. But 3 weeks before the ship was set to sail from Southampton, Colin started having a dream so vivid and terrifying that he couldn't stop talking about it. And I mean, he literally couldn't stop. He wrote letters to his family, told his friends, even mentioned it to his supervisor at the shipyard. The dream was consuming his thoughts during his waking hours. In his dream, Colin saw himself working in the engine room of a massive ship. Not just any ship, but specifically the Titanic. He could see the gleaming brass fittings, the massive boilers, the complex network of pipes and gauges that he'd spent months studying in preparation for the voyage. Every detail was perfectly accurate to the ship's actual specifications, but then the dream would take a horrifying turn. Cullen would hear a sound that he described as like thunder, but wrong somehow, like the sound of the world breaking apart. He would feel the entire ship shudder, would see steam pipes bursting, would watch as freezing seawater began rushing into the engine room through gaps in the hull that shouldn't have existed. Here's where Cullen's dream gets unnaturally specific. He described seeing the exact angle the ship would tilt as it began to sink, not just the ship tilted, but a precise description of how the ball would dip down while the stern rose up, creating a slope that would make it impossible to walk normally through the corridors. He wrote about how the ship would break apart in two sections, with the bow sinking first while the stern remained temporarily afloat. Cullen also dreamed about the people, passengers in nightgowns and life jackets, crew members running through corridors shouting instructions, the sound of the ship's orchestra playing music to try to keep people calm. He described seeing lifeboats being lowered into the water, but not enough lifeboats. Never enough lifeboats for all the people who needed them. But the most terrifying part of Cullen's dream was how it ended. He saw himself trapped in the engine room as freezing water rushed in, unable to escape because he was trying to keep the power running so people could see to get to the lifeboats. He described the exact temperature of the water cold enough to stop your heart in minutes, and the specific way the electrical systems would fail as the seawater reached them. Cullen's letters to his family included details that would later prove to be unnaturally accurate. He wrote about how the water would be exactly 28 degrees Fahrenheit, how long it would take for the ship to sink. He predicted 2 hours and 40 minutes. The actual time was 2 hours and 37 minutes, and even the specific sounds the metal hull would make as it buckled under the pressure of the Atlantic. His sister Margaret later testified that Cullen had described the dream with such vivid detail that she could visualize the entire disaster herself. He told her about the sound of people screaming, about the way the ship's lights would flicker and go out section by section, about the eerie silence that would fall over the ocean after the ship disappeared beneath the waves. What makes Cullen's story particularly chilling is that he wasn't just having random nightmares about ships sinking. His dreams included specific technical details about how the Titanic's hull would fail, how the watertight compartments would be breached, how the ship's electrical systems would malfunction as seawater reached them. This was information that even most engineers wouldn't have been able to predict accurately. Cullen described dreaming about the ice, not just that the ship would hit an iceberg, but the specific shape and size of the ice that would cause the damage. He wrote about seeing a mountain of ice that looked like it was carved by God's own hand, and described how the collision would create a series of small punctures in the hull rather than one large gash. The really eerie part? Cullen tried to get out of the assignment. He went to his supervisor at Harland and Wolff shipyard and basically said, "I know this sounds crazy, but I think this ship is going to sink and I'm going to die on it." In 1912, that was like telling your boss you couldn't come to work because you consulted a crystal ball. His supervisor, a man named William Patterson, later wrote in his diary about Cullen's visit. Patterson described Cullen as normally a sensible and practical young man who seemed genuinely terrified by his dreams. But Patterson also wrote that Cullen's fears were clearly the result of pre-voyage nerves, and that refusing to board the Titanic would be career suicide. Patterson tried to reassure Cullen by showing him the ship's safety features, the watertight compartments, the advanced communications equipment, the extensive lifeboat drills that the crew would be conducting. "It's the biggest, safest ship ever built," Patterson told him. "The naval architects have thought of everything. What could possibly go wrong?" Those words, "what could possibly go wrong," would haunt Patterson for the rest of his life. He became obsessed with Cullen's story after the disaster, spending years researching prophetic dreams and trying to understand how someone could have predicted such a specific tragedy. Cullen reluctantly agreed to board the Titanic, but his behavior during the voyage was unusual enough that other crew members noticed. According to survivors' accounts, Colin spent the entire voyage looking nervous and telling anyone who'd listen about his dream. He carried a letter from his sister in his pocket at all times, and would often be found staring out at the ocean with what one crew member described as the expression of a man watching his own execution. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, actually spoke with Colin during the voyage after hearing about his concerns. Andrews later told survivors that Colin had described specific structural vulnerabilities in the ship's hull that Andrews himself had worried about during the design process. But Andrews had been assured by his calculations that these vulnerabilities would never become critical because the ship would never encounter conditions severe enough to exploit them. The irony is that Colin's technical knowledge made his prophetic dreams even more accurate. He understood exactly how the ship's systems worked. So when his subconscious mind was somehow accessing information about the future disaster, it could incorporate realistic technical details about how the ship would actually fail. Colin also had recurring dreams about the rescue efforts. He described seeing the Carpathia arriving hours after the sinking, picking up survivors from lifeboats floating in the icy Atlantic. He dreamed about the exact number of people who would survive. He predicted 710. The actual number was 705, and even described the specific injuries and symptoms that survivors would display after hours in the freezing water. On the night of April 14, 1912, Colin was on duty in the engine room when the Titanic struck the iceberg. According to the testimony of Frederick Scott, another engineer who survived, Colin's reaction to the collision was immediate and intense. He looked at me and said, "This is it. This is exactly what I dreamed," Scott later wrote. As the ship began to take on water, Colin's behavior became almost methodical. While other crew members were panicking or trying to assess the damage, Colin immediately began the procedures for keeping the ship's power systems running as long as possible. He seemed to know exactly what needed to be done and in what order. Joseph Bell, the chief engineer, later praised Colin's actions during the disaster. Bell wrote that Colin worked with the efficiency of a man who had rehearsed these exact procedures many times, and that his technical knowledge allowed him to keep the ship's generators running much longer than would have been possible otherwise. The lights staying on during the evacuation saved hundreds of lives. Without electrical power, the ship would have been plunged into darkness, making it impossible for passengers to find their way to the boat deck or for crew members to coordinate the lowering of lifeboats. Colin's decision to stay at his post, keeping the power running while the ship sank beneath him, was exactly what he had dreamed about for weeks. Scott, who was one of the last people to see Colin alive, reported that Colin seemed almost calm during the final minutes. "He told me to get to the lifeboats, that someone needed to survive to tell the story," Scott wrote. He said he dreamed this moment so many times that he wasn't afraid anymore. He knew what he had to do. Colin McDonald was last seen by another engineer around 2:05 a.m., about 15 minutes before the ship broke apart. He was at his post in the engine room, monitoring the gauges and adjusting the steam pressure to keep the generators running. The lights stayed on almost until the very end, allowing hundreds more people to find the lifeboats in the darkness. His body was never recovered, but survivors later said the lights stayed on almost until the Titanic disappeared beneath the waves. This was considered remarkable by maritime experts, who had expected the ship's electrical systems to fail much earlier in the sinking process. The really haunting part of Colin's story is how his family reacted to news of his death. His sister Margaret said that when she received the telegram informing her that Colin had died in the Titanic disaster, her first thought wasn't surprise or disbelief. It was relief that his nightmares were finally over. She'd been watching him suffer through weeks of prophetic dreams, and part of her had been hoping that the voyage would either prove his dreams wrong or finally end his psychological torment. Margaret kept all of Colin's letters describing his prophetic dreams, and they became some of the most detailed documentation of precognitive experiences related to the Titanic disaster. Researchers who studied Colin's case decades later were amazed by the accuracy of his predictions, particularly the technical details about how the ship's systems would fail. What makes Colin's story even more remarkable is that he wasn't the only crew member who had prophetic dreams about the disaster. At least 3 other engineers reported having similar nightmares in the weeks before the voyage, though none as detailed or specific as Collins. It's as if the tragedy was so significant that it somehow reached backward through time to warn the people who would be most directly affected. But here's the question that haunts me about Collins' story. If he knew exactly what was going to happen, why didn't he do more to prevent it? Why didn't he refuse to board the ship regardless of the career consequences? Why didn't he try to warn the passengers or convince the captain to change course? The answer, I think, is that Colin intuitively understood something that most of us would struggle to accept, that some events are so pivotal to the flow of history that they can't be prevented, only experienced. The Titanic disaster changed maritime safety regulations forever, led to the creation of international ice patrol services, and fundamentally altered how we think about human hubris and technological overconfidence. Maybe Collins' prophetic dreams weren't warnings to save himself, but preparation to save others. By staying at his post and keeping the power running, he enabled the rescue of hundreds of people who would otherwise have died in the darkness. His death wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a heroic act that had been rehearsed in his dreams for weeks. Colin MacDonald died exactly as he dreamed, trapped in the engine room, keeping the power running while the ship sank beneath him. But his sacrifice allowed hundreds of others to survive the disaster and return to their families. Makes you wonder if some people are given these prophetic dreams not as warnings to save themselves, but as preparation to save others when destiny calls upon them to make the ultimate sacrifice. Let's travel back to 1348 during the Black Death, when a Venetian physician named Giovanni de' Medici, no relation to the famous banking family, just unfortunate naming that would follow him to his grave, had what might be history's most detailed prophetic death dream during one of humanity's darkest periods. Picture Venice in 1348, not the romantic city of gondolas and grand palaces that we think of today, but a medieval port city under siege by an invisible enemy. The Black Death had arrived from the east along the same trade routes that had made Venice wealthy, and it was tearing through the population like a supernatural force bent on ending civilization itself. Giovanni was one of those plague doctors, the guys with the creepy bird-like masks filled with herbs and aromatic substances, thinking they could protect themselves from the pestilence by not breathing bad air. The whole miasma theory of disease, the idea that illness was caused by foul-smelling vapors, seems laughably primitive now, but in 1348 it was cutting-edge medical science. Giovanni's mask was particularly elaborate, crafted by a Venetian artisan who specialized in carnival masks. The beak was filled with juniper berries, rosemary, and dried roses, creating a mixture that Giovanni believed would filter out the poisonous miasma that caused the plague. The mask's leather was dyed black, and the eye holes were fitted with crystal lenses that gave Giovanni an otherworldly appearance as he moved through the city's plague-ravaged neighborhoods. But Giovanni's dream wasn't about dying from the plague, which would have been the obvious fear for someone in his profession. By 1348, plague doctors had one of the highest mortality rates of any profession in Europe. They were constantly exposed to infected patients, worked in unsanitary conditions, and had no effective treatments for the disease they were fighting. Most plague doctors expected to die from the pestilence. It was almost considered an occupational hazard. Instead, Giovanni dreamed about dying in a very specific, very bizarre way that had absolutely nothing to do with disease. And the dream was so vivid, so cinematically detailed, that it consumed his thoughts during his waking hours and fundamentally changed how he approached his medical practice. In his dream, Giovanni saw himself in his own home, a modest, 2-story building near the Rialto Bridge that served as both his residence and his medical practice. The ground floor had been converted into a treatment room where he examined patients, prepared medicines, and performed what passed for surgery in the 14th century. The room was lit by oil lamps and candles, filled with the scent of herbs and the ever-present smell of vinegar that Giovanni used to purify the air. But in the dream, Giovanni wasn't treating typical plague patients with the familiar bubonic swellings, fever, and delirium. Instead, he was examining a young woman who had different symptoms entirely, symptoms that Giovanni's medical training hadn't prepared him to recognize. The woman in his dream was incredibly specific in her appearance, so much so that Giovanni could have recognized her from across a crowded piazza. She had dark hair that fell to her shoulders in waves, green eyes that seemed to hold an unusual intensity, and a distinctive crescent-shaped scar on her left hand between her thumb and forefinger. Giovanni dreamed about this scar in such detail that he could see how it had been caused. A childhood accident with a kitchen knife that had healed poorly, leaving a permanent mark. The woman was wearing a blue dress made of wool, with silver embroidery along the neckline and sleeves in a pattern that Giovanni recognized as typical of the cloth merchant's quarter. But the dress was torn at the right shoulder, as if she had been in some kind of struggle or had fallen while running through the narrow streets of Venice. What made this dream particularly disturbing was not just the visual details, but the emotional and psychological state that Giovanni could sense in the woman. In his dream, she wasn't just sick, she was consumed by a rage so intense that it seemed to radiate from her like heat from a forge. Her green eyes held a fury that Giovanni had never seen in any of his patients, not even those who were delirious with fever. Giovanni dreamed that as he leaned in to examine her, checking her pulse, looking for signs of fever following the standard procedures he'd developed over years of medical practice, the woman would suddenly grab his surgical knife from his medical kit. These weren't the sophisticated medical instruments we know today, but simple tools that Giovanni had crafted himself. A sharp blade for making incisions, a probe for examining wounds, and various implements for bloodletting and other medieval medical procedures. In the dream, the woman's movement was lightning fast and completely unexpected. One moment she was lying still, appearing to be barely conscious, and the next she was lunging at him with his own knife. Giovanni dreamed that she would stab him directly in the heart. Not a random wound, but a precise thrust that would pierce his heart and kill him almost instantly. But the dream didn't end with Giovanni's death. He experienced what happened next with terrifying clarity. In the dream, as soon as the woman stabbed him, she would immediately collapse and die herself, falling across his body as they both bled out on the stone floor of his treatment room. Giovanni dreamed about the specific way their blood would pool together, creating a dark stain that would seep into the gaps between the stones. The most chilling part of Giovanni's dream was how he experienced his own death. He felt the blade pierce his heart, felt the sharp pain followed by a strange numbness, felt his knees buckle as his body went into shock. He experienced his final moments with a clarity that was almost surgical in its precision, the gradual dimming of his vision, the sound of his own heartbeat slowing and then stopping, the cold sensation of his blood flowing out of his body. Giovanni wrote about this dream in his medical journal, which somehow survived the centuries and provides U.S. with a first-hand account of what might be the most detailed prophetic death dream ever recorded. His Latin is precise and clinical, describing the dream with the same methodical approach he used to document his patient's symptoms. "I felt the cold metal penetrate my flesh," Giovanni wrote. "I felt my blood, warm at first, then cooling as it flowed from my body. I heard my own breath becoming shallow, then ceasing entirely. I experienced the moment of death as if I were both victim and observer, dying and watching myself die simultaneously." What makes Giovanni's dream particularly unsettling is that he also dreamed about the woman's internal experience. He somehow knew that she was suffering from what we would now recognize as a severe brain fever, a condition that caused violent hallucinations, uncontrollable rage, and temporary madness. In the dream, Giovanni could sense that the woman wasn't attacking him out of malice, but because her fevered mind perceived him as a threat that needed to be eliminated. Giovanni was so disturbed by this dream that he began taking precautions that his colleagues found excessive and paranoid. He started asking his assistant, a young man named Paolo, to examine female patients first before he would enter the treatment room. He began requiring that family members be present during examinations of women, even though this was unusual for the time period. His colleagues at the Physicians' Guild thought Giovanni was losing his mind from the stress of the plague. Venice had lost nearly a third of its population to the Black Death, and many medical professionals were showing signs of what we would now recognize as trauma and psychological breakdown. Giovanni's obsession with his prophetic dream seemed like just another symptom of the psychological toll that the plague was taking on everyone who was trying to fight it. But Giovanni couldn't shake the feeling that his dream was more than just a stress-induced nightmare. He began carrying a small dagger for protection, which was unusual for a physician. He also started keeping detailed records of every female patient he treated, noting their appearance, symptoms, and behavior in case any of them matched the woman from his dream. For weeks after having the dream, Giovanni was hypervigilant about treating female patients who matched the description from his vision. He developed elaborate protocols for examining women safely, always ensuring that he had an escape route and that his medical instruments were secured. His assistant Paula later wrote that Giovanni seemed to be preparing for a specific threat that only he could see. The dream also affected Giovanni's medical practice in subtler ways. He became more interested in studying conditions that affected the mind and behavior rather than just physical ailments. He began documenting cases of patients who showed signs of mental disturbance, violent tendencies, or unusual psychological symptoms. This was unusual for medieval medicine, which typically focused on physical ailments and humoral imbalances. Giovanni's research into mental conditions was actually quite advanced for his time. He began to understand that some illnesses affected the brain in ways that could cause dramatic changes in personality and behavior. He documented cases of patients who had become violent or unpredictable due to fever, head injuries, or what he called corruption of the brain's natural humors. But despite his growing understanding of mental illness, Giovanni didn't make the connection between his dream and his medical research. He continued to fear the specific woman from his vision without recognizing that his dream might be preparing him to encounter a patient suffering from the exact type of brain fever he was studying. Then, in November 1348, reality collided with Giovanni's prophetic dream in the most terrifying way possible. A young woman appeared at his door, carried by two men who had found her collapsed in the street near the Doge's palace. She was barely conscious, burning with fever, and showing signs of severe delirium. Giovanni took one look at her and felt his blood turn to ice. Dark hair that fell to her shoulders in waves. Green eyes that seemed to hold an unusual intensity. A distinctive crescent-shaped scar on her left hand between her thumb and forefinger. She was wearing a blue dress made of wool, with silver embroidery along the neckline and sleeves. Torn at the right shoulder exactly as Giovanni had dreamed. Every single detail matched his prophetic vision perfectly. It was as if the woman from his nightmares had stepped directly into his waking life, bringing with her the promise of the death he had been dreading for months. Giovanni's assistant Paula was away that day, visiting his family in the countryside. The woman's carriers explained that her family had already died from the plague, and she had been wandering the streets alone for days before collapsing. There was no one else to care for her, and Giovanni couldn't simply let her die on his doorstep. His oath as a physician prevented him from abandoning a patient in need. According to a neighbor named Caterina Morosini, who witnessed what happened next, Giovanni hesitated at his own doorway for several minutes, staring at the woman with what she described as the look of a man seeing his own ghost. Caterina later testified that Giovanni appeared to be having an internal struggle, as if he was trying to decide whether to help the woman or turn her away. But Giovanni's medical training and ethical obligations ultimately overcame his fear. He was a physician, sworn to help the sick regardless of personal risk. He couldn't abandon a patient because of a dream, no matter how vivid or disturbing it had been. He brought the woman inside and placed her on the examination table in his treatment room. As Giovanni began his examination, he noticed that the woman's symptoms were unlike anything he had seen in typical plague cases. Instead of the familiar bubonic swellings, she showed signs of severe brain fever, high temperature, dilated pupils, and periods of violent delirium alternating with unconsciousness. Her behavior was erratic and unpredictable, and she seemed to be experiencing intense hallucinations. Giovanni should have recognized these symptoms from his research into mental conditions. If he had approached this case with the same clinical detachment he used for his other patients, he might have realized that the woman was suffering from a treatable condition rather than the plague. But his fear of his prophetic dream made him unable to think clearly or apply his medical knowledge effectively. As Giovanni leaned in to check the woman's pulse, following the exact same procedure he had dreamed about for months, she suddenly grabbed his surgical knife from his medical kit. Her movement was lightning fast and completely unexpected, exactly as Giovanni had dreamed. She lunged at him with the blade, stabbing him directly in the heart with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. The attack happened so quickly that Giovanni had no time to defend himself or call for help. The woman's fevered mind had apparently perceived him as a threat that needed to be eliminated, and she acted on this delusion with the desperate strength of someone fighting for their life. Giovanni collapsed immediately, feeling the blade pierce his heart just as he had experienced in his dream. The pain was exactly as he had envisioned, sharp and intense at first, then giving way to a strange numbness as his body went into shock. He experienced his death with the same clinical awareness he had brought to his medical practice, observing his own symptoms even as he died. The woman collapsed immediately after stabbing Giovanni, falling across his body as they both bled out on the stone floor of his treatment room. Her fevered strength had been exhausted by the violent act, and the brain fever that had driven her to attack him now claimed her life as well. Caterina Morosini, who had been watching from her window, saw Giovanni's door standing open and investigated when she realized something was wrong. She found the two bodies lying in pools of blood, the woman's hand still clutching the knife that had killed them both. The scene was exactly as Giovanni had described in his journal, two people who had died violently, their blood pooling together on the stone floor. The local authorities investigated the deaths and concluded that Giovanni had been killed by a plague victim suffering from delirium. They noted that the woman showed no signs of bubonic plague, but instead appeared to have died from a severe brain fever that had caused violent hallucinations and uncontrollable rage. The irony of Giovanni's death was not lost on his medical colleagues. Later examination of the woman's body revealed that she had indeed been suffering from a brain fever that Giovanni had been studying extensively. If he had been able to overcome his fear of his prophetic dream and approach her case with clinical detachment, he might have recognized her symptoms and provided effective treatment. Giovanni's research notes included detailed descriptions of exactly the type of condition that had affected his killer. He had documented the symptoms, understood the progression of the disease, and even developed some treatments that might have helped. But his prophetic dream had made him too terrified to think clearly when faced with the exact situation he had been preparing for. The woman could have been saved if Giovanni had recognized that her violent behavior was a symptom of treatable brain fever rather than an inevitable fate prophesied in his dreams. Instead, both of them died because Giovanni's fear of his prophetic vision prevented him from using his medical knowledge effectively. Giovanni de' Medici died exactly as he had dreamed, stabbed in the heart by a patient suffering from brain fever, in his own treatment room while trying to provide medical care. His prophetic dream had been accurate in every detail, down to the location of the wound and the sequence of events that led to both of their deaths. But here's the really twisted part. Giovanni's dream wasn't just a prediction of his death. It was also a roadmap for how he might have prevented it. By showing him the exact symptoms and behavior of his future killer, the dream had given him the information he needed to recognize and treat her condition. But his fear of the prophecy itself had prevented him from using this knowledge to save both of their lives. Sometimes knowing your fate doesn't help you avoid it. It just guarantees you'll walk straight into it with your eyes wide open, paralyzed by the very knowledge that was meant to set you free. Jump forward to 1778 during the American Revolution and meet Private Timothy Walsh from Massachusetts. Walsh was a 22-year-old farmer turned soldier who'd survived Valley Forge, multiple battles, and 2 years of what was basically the worst camping trip in American history. Picture this guy. Timothy wasn't your typical war hero material. He was about 5'6", maybe 140 pounds soaking wet, with the kind of wiry build that comes from years of working a small farm in colonial Massachusetts. Before the war, Timothy had never traveled more than 20 miles from the tiny village where he was born. His biggest adventure had been the annual trip to Boston to sell his family's corn and wheat at the market. But when the Continental Army started recruiting in 1775, Timothy felt the same patriotic fervor that was sweeping through the colonies. He wasn't particularly political. He couldn't read well enough to understand the philosophical arguments about taxation and representation, but he understood that foreign soldiers were occupying his homeland, and that seemed like something worth fighting about. Timothy enlisted in the 5th 10th Massachusetts Regiment in the spring of 1776, leaving behind his wife Sarah and their infant son Michael. Sarah was barely 18, and the idea of running the farm alone while raising a baby terrified her. But Timothy promised he'd be back before the harvest season, like most soldiers who had no idea they were signing up for what would become an 8-year war. The reality of military life in the Continental Army was nothing like Timothy had imagined. These weren't the professional soldiers you see in movies. They were farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers who had volunteered to fight the most powerful military force in the world with minimal training and equipment that was often older than they were. Timothy's musket was a hand-me-down from his father's service in the French and Indian War, and it misfired about 1 time in 4. His uniform was a mixture of homespun cloth and whatever pieces of military gear he could scavenge from battlefields. Most of the time, he marched barefoot because his boots had fallen apart and the Continental Congress couldn't afford to replace them. But Timothy had survived campaigns that killed thousands of other soldiers. He'd made it through the disaster at Brooklyn Heights, where Washington's army barely escaped complete annihilation. He'd endured the winter at Valley Forge, where soldiers left bloody footprints in the snow, and men died from cold and hunger more often than from enemy bullets. Valley Forge was where Timothy really learned what war was like. The Continental Army was falling apart. No supplies, no food, no pay, and no clear idea of whether they were winning or losing the war. Soldiers were deserting in droves, and those who stayed were surviving on what they could forage or steal from the surrounding countryside. Timothy later wrote to Sarah that Valley Forge was like living in hell, but with snow. He described sleeping 10 men to a tent, with nothing but thin blankets between them and the frozen ground. Food was so scarce that soldiers were boiling their leather boots to make soup. Disease was rampant, dysentery, typhus, and pneumonia killed more Continental soldiers that winter than the British Army had in all the previous battles combined. But somehow Timothy survived. He had what military historians call soldier's luck, the ability to be in the right place at the right time, to duck when bullets were flying, to avoid the diseases that killed his tent mates. By 1778, he was considered a veteran, one of the experienced soldiers that new recruits looked up to for guidance. Timothy had fought at Brandywine, where the Continental Army was outmaneuvered and nearly destroyed by British forces. He'd been at Germantown, where fog and confusion had turned a promising attack into a chaotic retreat. He participated in dozens of smaller skirmishes and raids, the kind of unglamorous warfare that doesn't make it into history books but slowly wore down both armies. But in March 1778, while stationed in New Jersey, Timothy started having a dream that was so specific and disturbing that he wrote about it in a letter to his wife. This wasn't unusual. Soldiers often wrote about their nightmares as a way of processing the trauma of warfare. But Timothy's dream was different. It wasn't about past battles or general fears about dying in combat. It was about a very specific way he would die in his next battle. In Timothy's dream, he was fighting in a forest clearing that had been damaged by previous battles. This was common in New Jersey, where the same areas had been fought over repeatedly as both armies moved back and forth across the state. Artillery bombardments and musket fire had turned many wooded areas into landscapes that looked like something from a nightmare. Broken trees, stumps everywhere, ground torn up by cannonballs and marching armies. Timothy's dream was unnaturally specific about the terrain. He described a clearing that was roughly circular, maybe 50 yards across, surrounded by oak and maple trees that had been damaged by cannon fire. Some trees had been cut down entirely, leaving stumps that soldiers used as cover during firefights. Other trees had been damaged but were still standing, with broken branches hanging down like skeletal arms. The ground in Timothy's dream was scarred by previous battles, holes from cannonballs, trenches that had been dug and abandoned, areas where the earth had been churned up by marching feet and gun carriages. Timothy described the smell of the place, gunpowder residue, rotting leaves, and the sweet, sick smell of blood that had soaked into the earth. But the most disturbing part of Timothy's dream wasn't the setting, it was how he would die. Timothy dreamed that he would be pursuing a British soldier who was retreating through the woods after a skirmish. This was standard military procedure. When enemy forces broke and ran, you were supposed to pursue them to prevent them from regrouping and counterattacking. In the dream, Timothy was chasing a redcoat through the damaged forest, his musket loaded and ready to fire. The British soldier was maybe 20 yards ahead of him, running between the broken trees and stumps, trying to escape back to his own lines. Timothy could see the man clearly in his dream, a young soldier, probably about his own age, with light brown hair and a uniform that was torn and dirty from battle. But as Timothy pursued the fleeing soldier, he would run directly into one of those hanging branches. The branch would catch his neck like a noose, and his own momentum would essentially hang him while he was running. Timothy described the dream with details that were almost medical in their precision, the feeling of the branch catching his throat, the sensation of his feet leaving the ground, the specific way his vision would go dark around the edges. What made this dream particularly disturbing was that Timothy experienced his own death from the inside. He felt his windpipe being crushed, felt his lungs struggling for air that couldn't reach them, felt the panic of suffocation combined with the physical trauma of having his neck snapped by the impact. Timothy wrote to Sarah that he could feel his own heartbeat slowing and then stopping, could sense the exact moment when his consciousness would fade away. Timothy also dreamed about what would happen after his death. He saw his body hanging from the broken tree, still suspended by the branch that had killed him. He dreamed about other Continental soldiers finding his corpse hours later, about them cutting him down and trying to figure out what had happened. In the dream, Timothy could observe his own funeral from some kind of external perspective, watching as his fellow soldiers buried him in a shallow grave marked only with a crude wooden cross. The dream was so vivid and disturbing that Timothy couldn't stop thinking about it during his waking hours. He found himself studying every forest clearing where his regiment made camp, looking for terrain that matched what he'd seen in his dream. He became obsessed with avoiding situations where he might end up chasing enemy soldiers through wooded areas. Timothy's behavior became unusual enough that his tent mates noticed. Sergeant William Morrison later wrote in his journal that Timothy had become uncommonly nervous about forest fighting and seemed to be constantly watching the trees overhead as if expecting them to attack him. Morrison thought Timothy was suffering from what they called soldier's heart, what we would now recognize as combat stress or PTSD, but Timothy knew his dream was different from ordinary war nightmares. He'd been having those for years, dreams about past battles, about friends who had died, about the general horrors of warfare. This dream felt different. It had a clarity and specificity that made it feel more like a memory than a nightmare, as if he was remembering something that had already happened rather than imagining something that might happen. Timothy tried to avoid his fate by changing his behavior during combat. He started volunteering for rear guard duties, for kitchen work, for anything that would keep him away from direct combat in wooded areas. When his unit was assigned to patrol duties in the forests of New Jersey, Timothy would volunteer to stay at camp and maintain equipment or guard supplies. His strategy worked for a few weeks. While his unit engaged in skirmishes around Trenton and Princeton, Timothy managed to avoid the kind of forest fighting that he'd seen in his dream. He convinced himself that he had outsmarted destiny, that by changing his behavior he could avoid the fate that his subconscious had shown him. But Timothy's avoidance strategy created problems with his military service. Other soldiers began to notice that he was avoiding combat duties, and some of them started to question his courage. In the Continental Army, accusations of cowardice were taken very seriously. Soldiers who were thought to be shirking their duties could be court-martialed and executed. Sergeant Morrison confronted Timothy about his behavior, asking him directly if he was afraid to fight. Timothy tried to explain about his prophetic dream, but Morrison dismissed it as the imaginings of a nervous mind. Morrison told Timothy that if he didn't start participating in combat duties, he would be reported to the company commander as a potential deserter. Timothy was trapped between his fear of his prophetic dream and his fear of being executed for cowardice. He couldn't abandon his military service without being branded as a deserter, but he also couldn't bring himself to engage in the kind of forest fighting that he believed would lead to his death. The situation came to a head during the Battle of Monmouth. In June 1778, this was a major engagement between Washington's Continental Army and British forces under General Henry Clinton. It was one of the largest battles of the Revolutionary War, involving thousands of soldiers on both sides and fought in the brutal heat of a New Jersey summer. Timothy's regiment was assigned to the advance guard, which meant they would be among the first troops to engage the enemy. There was no way for Timothy to avoid combat without openly deserting his post, which would have meant certain execution. He marched to battle knowing that he might be walking into the exact scenario from his prophetic dream. The battle took place in a landscape that was eerily similar to what Timothy had dreamed about. The fighting moved through areas that had been contested repeatedly during the war, with forests that had been damaged by previous battles and artillery bombardments. Broken trees, stumps, and scarred earth created exactly the kind of terrain that Timothy had seen in his nightmare. During the battle, Timothy's unit was ordered to pursue a group of British soldiers who had broken from their formation and were retreating through a wooded area. This was exactly the tactical situation that Timothy had been dreading, chasing enemy soldiers through a damaged forest, where broken branches hung down like natural traps. Timothy found himself in the exact forest clearing from his dream. The terrain was identical in every detail: the circular shape, the broken trees, the stumps, and scarred earth. Even the smell was the same: gunpowder, rotting leaves, and the metallic scent of blood that had soaked into the ground from previous battles. When a British soldier broke rank and started retreating through the woods, Timothy's training and instincts took over. Despite his fear of his prophetic dream, he couldn't ignore direct orders to pursue the enemy. He started chasing the redcoat through the broken forest, his musket loaded and ready to fire. According to witnesses, Timothy suddenly stopped mid-pursuit and looked up at the damaged trees hanging overhead. Private James Sullivan, who was fighting nearby, later wrote that Timothy stood frozen in place for several seconds, staring up at the branches with the expression of a man who had seen his own death. Sullivan reported that Timothy seemed to be having an internal struggle, as if he was trying to decide whether to continue the pursuit or retreat to safety. But by then, the chaos of battle and his own momentum had carried him too far forward to turn back. The British soldier was getting away, and Timothy's duty as a soldier required him to continue the pursuit. Timothy resumed chasing the fleeing enemy soldier, but now he was moving more cautiously, trying to avoid the hanging branches that he knew posed a deadly threat. He ducked under some branches, pushed others aside with his musket, and tried to find a path through the damaged forest that would allow him to avoid the fate he had dreamed about. But the forest was dense with broken trees and hanging branches, and Timothy couldn't pursue the enemy effectively while also avoiding every potential hazard. In his attempt to avoid one hanging branch, he ran directly into another, a thick oak branch that had been broken by cannon fire and was hanging down at exactly the right height to catch a running man's neck. The impact happened exactly as Timothy had dreamed. The branch caught his throat, his momentum carried him forward, and his feet left the ground as the branch essentially hanged him while he was running. Timothy's musket fell from his hands and discharged into the air, alerting nearby soldiers that something had gone wrong. Private Sullivan found Timothy's body several hours later, still suspended from the broken oak branch. Timothy's neck had been broken by the impact, and he had died almost instantly. His unfired musket was lying on the ground below him, exactly as he had described in his letter to Sarah. Sullivan later wrote that discovering. Timothy's body was one of the most unsettling experiences of his military service. It was as if he had been executed by the forest itself, Sullivan wrote. The branch had caught him so perfectly that it looked like a trap that had been set specifically for him. The other soldiers in Timothy's unit were disturbed by the circumstances of his death. They had seen men die in every conceivable way during the war. Shot, stabbed, blown apart by cannon fire, killed by disease and starvation. But Timothy's death seemed different somehow, as if he had been killed by fate itself rather than by the normal hazards of warfare. Sergeant Morrison, who had dismissed Timothy's fears as cowardice, was particularly troubled by what had happened. Morrison later wrote in his journal that Timothy's death had made him question whether some men might have genuine premonitions about their own deaths. "Perhaps Walsh saw something that the rest of us could not," Morrison wrote. Perhaps his fear was not cowardice, but wisdom. Timothy's body was buried in a shallow grave marked with a crude wooden cross, exactly as he had dreamed. His personal effects were sent back to Sarah, including the letter in which he had described his prophetic dream in detail. Sarah kept the letter for the rest of her life, and it eventually made its way into the archives of the Massachusetts Historical Society. The really heartbreaking part of Timothy's story is Sarah's response to his death. When she received the letter describing his prophetic dream, along with the official notification of his death, her first reaction wasn't grief, but a kind of terrible understanding. She wrote to Timothy's mother, "He saw it coming. He tried to warn me, tried to prepare me, but knowing it was going to happen didn't make it hurt any less." Sarah never remarried, and she raised their son Michael as a single mother on the family farm. She often told Michael stories about his father's service in the Continental Army, but she never mentioned Timothy's prophetic dream. She seemed to believe that some knowledge was too disturbing to pass on to the next generation. Michael Walsh grew up to become a successful farmer and local politician, never knowing that his father had dreamed of his own death weeks before it happened. Sarah took the secret of Timothy's prophetic dream to her grave, along with the letter that documented one of the most detailed precognitive experiences in American military history. Timothy Walsh died exactly as he had dreamed, hanged by a broken tree branch while pursuing an enemy soldier through a forest that had been damaged by previous battles. His death was so specific and unusual that it became a story that was told and retold throughout the Continental Army, though most soldiers didn't know about the prophetic dream that had predicted it. The really tragic part is that Timothy might have survived if he had been able to overcome his fear of his prophetic dream. His attempts to avoid the fate he had seen in his sleep made him hesitant and distracted during the battle, which may have actually caused him to run into the exact trap he was trying to avoid. Sometimes prophetic dreams aren't warnings that allow us to change our fate, they're just advance notice of events that are already set in motion. Timothy's dream gave him weeks to prepare for his death, but it didn't give him the power to prevent it. The British soldier that Timothy was pursuing when he died was later captured by other Continental soldiers. When questioned, the redcoat said that he had been trying to surrender when Timothy started chasing him, and that he had been leading Timothy toward a group of American soldiers who could have accepted his surrender safely. If Timothy had been able to think clearly instead of being paralyzed by fear of his prophetic dream, he might have realized that the British soldier was trying to surrender rather than escape. Timothy died pursuing an enemy who was already defeated, killed by a fate that he had seen coming but couldn't find the courage to face directly. Dreams don't just happen to you, sometimes they happen through you, showing you not just your personal destiny but the strange way individual choices create the larger patterns of history itself. Moving into some slightly shorter but equally eerie tales, let's talk about Robert MacLeod, a lighthouse keeper on the Scottish coast in 1923. Robert had been tending the same lighthouse for 15 years without incident. Just him, the rotating light, and the endless rhythm of waves against rocks. Picture this isolated existence. Robert's lighthouse stood on a rocky outcrop called Beacon Point, about 3 miles from the nearest village on the Isle of Skye. The lighthouse itself was a massive stone tower, built in 1847 during the Great Expansion of Scotland's coastal navigation system. It rose 120 feet above the churning waters of the North Atlantic, its beacon visible for nearly 20 miles on a clear night. Robert had taken the job in 1908, after his wife, Margaret, had died in the influenza pandemic that swept through Scotland. He'd been a fisherman before that, working the same waters that he now watched over from his tower. But after Margaret's death, Robert found that he couldn't bear to be around other people. The lighthouse job offered him the solitude he needed to process his grief, along with the sense of purpose that came from guiding ships safely through some of the most treacherous waters in the British Isles. The lighthouse keeper's quarters were built into the base of the tower, a small kitchen, a sitting room with a stone fireplace, and a bedroom that Robert had shared with no one for 15 years. The walls were thick stone, designed to withstand the worst storms that the North Atlantic could produce. Robert had weathered countless gales in that lighthouse, had seen waves crash over the rocks with enough force to shake the entire structure, had watched ships struggle through storms that would have terrified sailors half his age. Robert's daily routine was as predictable as the tides. He would rise at dawn, climb the spiral staircase to the lamp room, and perform the maintenance tasks that kept the light operational. The lighthouse used a massive Fresnel lens system with oil-burning lamps that required constant attention. Robert would clean the lens, trim the wicks, refill the oil reservoirs, and check the mechanical rotation system that made the light sweep across the water in its distinctive pattern. During the day, Robert would perform maintenance on the lighthouse structure itself, repairing weathering damage, painting the exterior, maintaining the fog signal equipment, and keeping detailed logs of weather conditions and ship traffic. The lighthouse service required meticulous record keeping, and Robert's logbooks were models of precision and completeness. But Robert's isolation wasn't complete. He had a small rowing boat that he used to make weekly trips to the village for supplies, and he maintained correspondence with his sister Flora, who lived in Edinburgh. His letters to Flora provide us with detailed documentation of his daily life, including the prophetic dreams that would eventually lead to his death. In September 1923, Robert started having a very specific recurring dream about a massive storm that would hit during his night shift. But this wasn't just any storm. Robert had experienced hundreds of storms during his years at the lighthouse, and he knew the difference between normal weather and something truly dangerous. In his dream, Robert saw a storm approaching from the northwest with unprecedented fury. He described it in a letter to Flora as not like any storm I've seen in 40 years of working these waters. The dream showed him wind speeds that would exceed anything in the meteorological records, waves that would crash over the lighthouse itself, and atmospheric conditions that would create what Robert called unnatural electrical activity. But the most disturbing part of Robert's dream wasn't the storm itself, it was how he would die during it. Robert dreamed that he would be in the lamp room at the top of the lighthouse, performing his routine maintenance on the light mechanism, when hurricane-force winds would shatter the thick glass windows that protected the lamp room from the elements. The lamp room windows were made of specially manufactured glass, designed to withstand extreme weather conditions. They were nearly 2 inches thick and had been tested to resist wind speeds of up to 100 miles per hour. In 15 years of service, Robert had never seen these windows even crack, let alone shatter completely. But in his dream, Robert saw the windows exploding inward with tremendous force, sending razor-sharp glass fragments flying through the lamp room like shrapnel. He described the sound in his letter to Flora like cannon fire, but sharper somehow, the sound of the world breaking apart. Robert dreamed that he would be struck by multiple pieces of flying glass, with the largest fragment cutting his throat so severely that he would bleed to death within minutes. But the most terrifying part of the dream was that Robert would continue working to keep the light operational even as he was dying, knowing that ships were depending on his beacon to navigate safely through the storm. I saw myself bleeding to death while still trying to maintain the light, Robert wrote to Flora. I could feel my life flowing out of me, but I couldn't stop working. There were ships out there in the darkness, and they needed the light to survive. Robert's letters to Flora included unusually specific details about the storm from his dream. He described the exact direction it would come from, northwest, following a track that would bring it directly over Beacon Point. He predicted wind speeds of over 120 miles per hour, wave heights of up to 80 feet, and atmospheric pressure readings that would be the lowest ever recorded in the region. Most remarkably, Robert predicted the exact time that the storm would reach its peak intensity at his lighthouse to 2:47 a.m. He had this specific time in his dream repeatedly, and he wrote to Flora that he was certain the dangerous moment would occur at that precise time. Robert also dreamed about the broader impact of the storm on shipping in the area. He saw multiple vessels in distress, struggling to navigate through conditions that exceeded their design capabilities. But he also saw these ships successfully avoiding the rocks around Beacon Point because his lighthouse beam continued to operate despite the devastating conditions. "The light saves them," Robert wrote to Flora. "Even though I die keeping it running, the ships make it through safely. My death serves a purpose. It's not just meaningless tragedy." For weeks after having this dream, Robert checked weather reports obsessively, looking for any sign that the storm from his vision might be approaching. He consulted with the meteorological office in Edinburgh, requesting detailed forecasts for the North Atlantic shipping routes. But the weather experts predicted a calm autumn, with no major storms expected until the traditional winter storm season. Robert's behavior became unusual enough that the lighthouse service supervisor, Captain James Morrison, noticed during his quarterly inspection visit. Morrison later wrote in his report that Robert seemed uncommonly nervous about weather conditions and appeared to be preparing for some specific emergency that he couldn't adequately explain. Robert had begun stockpiling emergency supplies, extra oil for the lamp, spare parts for the light mechanism, additional food stores, and even medical supplies that went far beyond the standard lighthouse first aid kit. He also made unusual modifications to the lamp room, installing additional securing devices for the light mechanism and creating backup systems that could keep the beacon operational even if the primary equipment failed. Captain Morrison asked Robert about these preparations, and Robert tried to explain about his prophetic dream. But Morrison dismissed Robert's concerns as the anxieties of a man who has spent too many years in isolation. Morrison noted in his report that lighthouse keepers often developed obsessive concerns about weather and safety after years of solitary service. Robert also wrote detailed instructions for his replacement, including specific procedures for operating the lighthouse during extreme weather conditions. He created technical diagrams showing how to maintain the light if the lamp room windows were damaged, and he developed contingency plans for every possible equipment failure scenario. "I may not survive the storm I've seen in my dreams," Robert wrote to Flora, "but I want to make sure that whoever comes after me will be able to keep the light running no matter what conditions they face." Robert's sister Flora was deeply concerned about his mental state. She wrote back suggesting that Robert request a transfer to a lighthouse closer to populated areas, where he wouldn't be so isolated. She also suggested that Robert take a leave of absence to visit her in Edinburgh, hoping that time away from the lighthouse might help him overcome his obsession with the prophetic dream. But Robert felt that he couldn't abandon his post. He had a deep sense of responsibility to the ships that depended on his lighthouse for safe navigation. He also seemed to believe that his dream was showing him not just his personal fate, but his role in a larger story about duty and sacrifice. "I've been placed here for a reason," Robert wrote to Flora. "The dream shows me that my death will serve a purpose. I can't run away from that responsibility, no matter how much I might want to." On the night of October 15, 1923, Robert was performing his routine maintenance in the lamp room when he noticed unusual changes in the atmospheric conditions. The barometric pressure was dropping rapidly. The wind was shifting to the northwest, and the sea was beginning to show the long, rolling swells that typically preceded major storms. Robert's weather instruments were showing readings that matched his prophetic dream exactly. The wind speed was increasing steadily, the wave height was growing, and the atmospheric pressure was falling toward the record low levels that he had predicted. Robert realized that he was about to experience the exact storm that had been haunting his dreams for weeks. At 2:30 a.m., the storm reached Beacon Point with fury that exceeded even Robert's prophetic vision. Wind speeds reached 125 miles per hour. Waves crashed over the lighthouse itself, and the atmospheric electrical activity was so intense that it interfered with the light mechanism's operation. Robert was in the lamp room, working frantically to keep the beacon operational, when the windows exploded inward at exactly 2:47 a.m. The specially manufactured glass shattered under wind pressure that exceeded all design specifications, sending razor-sharp fragments flying through the lamp room with deadly force. Robert was struck by multiple pieces of glass, with the largest fragment cutting his throat exactly as he had dreamed. But instead of collapsing immediately, Robert continued working to maintain the light, knowing that ships were depending on his beacon to navigate safely through the unprecedented storm. The lighthouse beam continued to operate throughout the storm, guiding several ships safely past the rocks around Beacon Point. The merchant vessel SS Caledonia later reported that Robert's lighthouse had saved them from certain destruction, allowing them to navigate through conditions that would have been impossible without the beacon's guidance. Robert McLeod was found the next morning, having bled to death from glass cuts to his throat. But the lighthouse beam was still functioning perfectly. His body was slumped over the light mechanism, his hands still gripping the controls that he had died trying to operate. The storm had come from the exact direction Robert had predicted, with wind speeds and wave heights that matched his prophetic dream precisely. The atmospheric pressure had reached record low levels, and the electrical activity had been so intense that it disrupted telegraph communications throughout the region. Ships reported later that without Robert's lighthouse beam that night, they would have been driven onto the rocks around Beacon Point. The storm had been so severe that normal navigation methods were impossible, and the lighthouse was the only reference point that allowed vessels to maintain safe courses through the treacherous waters. Robert McLeod died exactly as he had dreamed, but his sacrifice saved dozens of lives and prevented what could have been one of the worst maritime disasters in Scottish history. His prophetic dream had shown him not just his personal fate, but his role in protecting the lives of strangers who would never know his name. The Lighthouse Service investigated the circumstances of Robert's death and concluded that he had performed his duties with extraordinary courage and dedication. His actions during the storm were cited as an example of the highest traditions of lighthouse service, and his name was added to the memorial for lighthouse keepers who had died in the line of duty. Flora McLeod kept all of Robert's letters describing his prophetic dream, and they became part of the official record of the incident. The letters provided detailed documentation of one of the most accurate weather predictions in Scottish maritime history, made weeks before the storm occurred and based entirely on a recurring dream. Robert's replacement, a young keeper named David Campbell, reported that the lighthouse seemed to be haunted by the presence of someone who had died protecting it. Campbell claimed that, during severe weather, he could sometimes hear Robert's voice in the wind, calling out warnings and instructions for maintaining the light under dangerous conditions. The lighthouse at Beacon Point continued to operate until 1954, when it was replaced by an automated beacon system. But local fishermen still report seeing a light in the abandoned tower during severe storms, as if Robert McLeod's spirit continues to guide ships safely through the treacherous waters around his lighthouse. Robert McLeod died exactly as he had dreamed, killed by flying glass during a record-breaking storm, but successfully keeping his lighthouse operational long enough to save the lives of sailors who were depending on his beacon for safe navigation through conditions that exceeded all previous experience. In 1934, a trapeze artist named Elena Volkov was performing with a traveling circus in rural Alabama. Elena was known for her death-defying aerial acts, performing without a net because she claimed it made the audience more excited and the performance more authentic. Picture the world of traveling circuses in Depression-era America. These weren't the grand, permanent spectacles we might imagine today, but ramshackle operations that moved from town to town in a convoy of battered trucks and trailers. The Barnaby Brothers Circus was one of dozens of small traveling shows that brought entertainment to rural communities that rarely saw any form of professional performance. Elena Volkov wasn't her real name, of course. She'd been born Elena Kowalski in a Polish immigrant community in Chicago, but circus performers in the 1930s needed exotic, mysterious names to capture the public imagination. Volkov sounded Russian and dangerous, which fit perfectly with her daredevil persona and her signature act that left audiences gasping with terror and excitement. Elena had joined the circus in 1929, right after the stock market crash that devastated the American economy. She'd been working in a factory in Chicago, but when the factory closed and jobs became impossible to find, Elena discovered that her childhood gymnastics training could be transformed into a way to make a living. The circus offered her steady work, travel, and the kind of excitement that factory life had never provided. The Barnaby Brothers Circus specialized in acts that emphasized danger over sophistication. They couldn't compete with the big shows like Ringling Brothers in terms of spectacle or production values, so they focused on performers who were willing to take risks that the major circuses wouldn't allow. Elena's act was the perfect fit for their philosophy, genuine danger that made audiences feel like they were witnessing something that could go horribly wrong at any moment. Elena's signature performance involved a series of increasingly difficult trapeze maneuvers performed without a safety net, culminating in what she called the Devil's Dance, a triple somersault between two swinging trapezes that required perfect timing and extraordinary athleticism. The act was performed to dramatic music, with Elena wearing a costume that sparkled in the spotlights as she flew through the air above the circus ring. But Elena wasn't just performing dangerous stunts for show. She genuinely believed that the risk of death was what made circus performance meaningful. She'd grown up during World War I, had lived through the Spanish flu pandemic, and had seen the economic devastation of the Great Depression. In Elena's worldview, life was inherently dangerous and unpredictable, so deliberately courting danger was a way of asserting control over an uncontrollable world. People come to the circus to see something they can't see anywhere else. Elena told a newspaper reporter in 1933, "They want to see someone who isn't afraid of death, who can dance with danger and make it look beautiful. If I use a net, I'm just another gymnast. Without the net, I'm offering them something transcendent." Elena's fellow performers respected her dedication but thought she was unnecessarily reckless. Most circus performers use safety equipment whenever possible. The risk of injury was already high enough without deliberately eliminating protective measures. But Elena insisted that safety nets ruined the aesthetic and emotional impact of her performance. The circus owner, Marcus Barnaby, supported Elena's approach because her act was one of the biggest draws for their show. Audiences would travel for miles to see the Flying Volkov perform her death-defying stunts, and the revenue from Elena's performances often meant the difference between the circus staying solvent and going bankrupt. But in the summer of 1934, Elena started having disturbing dreams about her final performance. These weren't the usual anxiety dreams that many performers experienced. Elena had been doing dangerous acts for 5 years and had long since overcome stage fright or fear of heights. Instead, Elena was dreaming about a very specific sequence of events that would lead to her death during what she somehow knew would be her final performance. The dream always played out the same way, with details so precise that Elena began writing them down in her diary. In her dream, Elena saw herself performing the Devil's Dance in front of an audience that seemed unusually large and enthusiastic. She could see specific faces in the crowd, a young boy in the front row wearing a striped shirt, an elderly woman clutching a handkerchief, a man in a business suit who seemed out of place at a rural circus performance. But as Elena reached the climactic moment of her act, the triple somersault between two swinging trapezes, one of the ropes would snap at the exact moment she released from the first trapeze. Elena described this moment in her diary with technical precision. The rope fails at the splice point where it connects to the rigging. I can hear the fibers tearing, can feel the sudden loss of tension. I fall directly onto the hard-packed earth of the circus ring. What made Elena's dream particularly disturbing was how she described the audience's reaction. In the dream, the crowd initially thought her fall was part of the act, so they applauded enthusiastically for several seconds before realizing that something was wrong. Elena could hear their applause turning to screams, as they understood that they were witnessing a real tragedy rather than a planned dramatic effect. I can hear them cheering as I fall, Elena wrote in her diary. They think it's part of the show until they see the blood. Then the cheering turns to horror, and I can feel their shock and grief as if it were my own. Elena also dreamed about her own physical experience of the fall and its aftermath. She described feeling the impact with the ground, the sensation of her neck breaking, and the strange experience of her consciousness fading while she could still hear the sounds of the circus around her, the music stopping abruptly, people shouting for a doctor, the sound of people running toward the ring. I don't die immediately, Elena wrote. I lie there for several minutes, paralyzed but still conscious, listening to the chaos around me. I can hear Marcus shouting orders, can hear someone crying, can hear the audience being asked to leave the tent. I experience my own death as a slow fade rather than a sudden ending. Elena became so obsessed with this dream that it began affecting her performance. She started insisting on inspecting her rigging equipment before every show, checking and rechecking the ropes, cables, and mounting points with an intensity that worried her fellow performers. Giuseppe Torino, the circus's rigging supervisor, later told investigators that Elena had become almost paranoid about equipment safety in the weeks before her death. She would spend hours examining every component of her trapeze setup, looking for signs of wear or weakness that might cause a failure. She knew those ropes and cables better than I did, Giuseppe said. She could spot a frayed strand or a weak splice from 20 feet away. But instead of making her feel safer, her knowledge seemed to make her more afraid. Elena also started asking Marcus Barnaby about using safety nets, which was completely unlike her usual attitude toward risk. She presented it as a way to try new, even more dangerous stunts. But Giuseppe noticed that Elena seemed genuinely frightened rather than excited about the possibility of adding new elements to her act. Marcus refused Elena's request to use safety nets, and his reasoning was purely commercial. People come to see death-defying performances, he told her. Take away the possibility of death, and it's just gymnastics. Your act is special because it's real danger, not fake danger. Marcus also pointed out that the circus was already struggling financially due to the economic depression, and they couldn't afford to invest in safety equipment that might reduce the audience appeal of their star attraction. Elena's act was one of the few things keeping the Barnaby Brothers Circus in business, and changing it might mean the end of their operation. Elena found herself trapped between her fear of her prophetic dream and the economic realities of Depression-era entertainment. She needed the job. Unemployment was over 20% in 1934, and opportunities for women to earn a living wage were extremely limited. She also felt a responsibility to her fellow performers, who depended on the success of her act to keep the circus operating. As the summer of 1934 progressed, Elena's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would sometimes freeze in the middle of her practice sessions, staring up at the rigging as if she expected it to fail at any moment. Other times, she would perform her routine with reckless intensity, as if she was trying to prove to herself that she could overcome her fears. Elena's roommate in the circus, a contortionist named Marie Dubois, later testified that Elena was having trouble sleeping and seemed to be in a constant state of anxiety about her upcoming performances. She would wake up in the middle of the night, sweating and talking about falling, Marie said. She kept saying that she could feel her death approaching, that it was waiting for her in the rigging above the circus ring. Elena also started writing letters to her family in Chicago, letters that read almost like final messages rather than routine correspondence. She wrote to her mother about how much she appreciated the sacrifices her parents had made to give her opportunities in America. She wrote to her younger brother about pursuing his dreams, but being careful not to take unnecessary risks. I feel like I'm living on borrowed time. Elena wrote to her mother in July 1934. Every performance could be my last, and I want to make sure I've said everything I need to say to the people I love. The end came on August 22, 1934, during what would indeed be Elena's final performance. The Barnaby Brothers Circus was performing in a small Alabama town called Millerville, population about 800, but the audience that night was unusually large due to word of mouth about Elena's death-defying act. Elena spent the afternoon before the show inspecting her equipment with even more intensity than usual. Giuseppe Torino watched her examine every rope, every cable, every mounting point with what he described as the concentration of someone defusing a bomb. Elena found no problems with the rigging, but she seemed increasingly agitated as showtime approached. Marie Dubois helped Elena with her costume and makeup, and she noticed that Elena was unusually quiet and focused. She seemed like someone preparing for a battle rather than a performance, Marie later said. She kept checking her equipment one more time, as if she was looking for a problem that she knew was there but couldn't find. The performance began normally, with Elena executing the early portions of her routine with her usual skill and grace. The audience was enthusiastic and responsive, cheering for each successful maneuver as Elena built toward the climactic devil's dance that concluded her act. But as Elena prepared for the triple somersault between the two swinging trapezes, everything played out exactly as she had dreamed. The rope snapped at the splice point where it connected to the rigging, making a sound that witnesses described as like a gunshot in the sudden silence of the circus tent. Elena fell directly onto the hard-packed earth of the circus ring, landing with an impact that could be heard throughout the tent. The audience initially applauded, thinking that the fall was part of the act, until they realized that Elena wasn't getting up. The applause turned to screams as people understood that they had witnessed a real tragedy. Children in the audience started crying, adults began shouting for medical help, and the entire atmosphere of entertainment and excitement transformed into chaos and horror. Elena survived the initial impact but was paralyzed from the neck down, exactly as she had dreamed. She remained conscious for several minutes, able to hear the sounds around her but unable to move or speak. Witnesses said that she seemed to be trying to communicate something, but her injuries made speech impossible. Dr. William Patterson, the local physician who was summoned to treat Elena, later testified that she appeared to be aware of her surroundings and seemed to understand what had happened to her. She was conscious and alert, but the spinal damage was severe, Dr. Patterson said. I could see in her eyes that she knew she was dying. Elena Volkov died about 10 minutes after the fall, surrounded by circus performers and local residents who had tried desperately to help her. Her final performance had played out exactly as she had dreamed, down to the specific details of how the rope would fail and how the audience would react. The investigation into Elena's death revealed that the rope failure had been caused by a manufacturing defect that would have been impossible to detect through visual inspection. The rope had appeared to be in perfect condition, but internal fiber damage had created a weak point that failed under the stress of Elena's performance. Giuseppe Torino was devastated by Elena's death, feeling that he should have somehow detected the rope's weakness despite its invisible nature. She trusted me to keep her safe, he said. She knew more about rigging than most professionals, but she still depended on me to maintain her equipment properly. I failed her. Marcus Barnaby closed the circus immediately after Elena's death, unable to continue operating without his star performer and traumatized by the loss of someone he considered part of his family. The Barnaby Brothers Circus never performed again, and most of the performers scattered to find work with other shows or left the circus business entirely. Elena's diary, containing detailed descriptions of her prophetic dreams about her final performance, was sent to her family in Chicago along with her other personal belongings. Her mother kept the diary for the rest of her life, reading Elena's predictions about her own death and marveling at their accuracy. The people of Millerville, Alabama, never forgot Elena Volkov's final performance. For decades afterward, older residents would tell stories about the beautiful trapeze artist who had died exactly as she had dreamed, falling from the sky while hundreds of people watched in horror. Elena Volkov died exactly as she had dreamed, falling from a failed trapeze rope during her signature act, in front of an audience who initially thought they were watching entertainment until they realized they were witnessing someone's prophetic dream come true in the most tragic way possible. Sometimes prophetic dreams aren't just about individual deaths, but about tragedies that affect entire communities. In 1947, Thomas Brennan was a foreman at a coal mine in Pennsylvania. Thomas had worked in mines for 20 years and knew every sound, every smell, every subtle sign that indicated danger underground. Picture this man. Thomas wasn't just any coal miner. He was what they called a mind reader. Someone who could walk through underground tunnels and sense things that other people missed. After 2 decades of working deep beneath the Pennsylvania mountains, Thomas had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect problems before they became disasters. Thomas came from a family of miners. His father had worked the same shafts. His grandfather had died in a cave-in back in 1923. And his 3 brothers all descended into the darkness every morning alongside him. The Brennan family had been pulling coal out of the Allegheny Mountains for 3 generations, and they knew the mines like other people knew their own neighborhoods. The mine where Thomas worked was called Black Creek No. 7, and it was considered one of the safer operations in the region. The company had invested in modern safety equipment, the tunnels were properly reinforced, and the ventilation systems were well maintained. Thomas had been promoted to foreman because of his reputation for preventing accidents and his ability to spot potential problems before they became serious. But Thomas's expertise went beyond just technical knowledge. He had what the other miners called the sense, an intuitive understanding of how the mine was feeling on any given day. He could tell when atmospheric pressure changes might affect gas levels, when recent blasting had created instabilities that weren't immediately visible, when the mountain itself was shifting in ways that could spell trouble. The other miners trusted Thomas's instincts completely. If Thomas said a tunnel felt wrong, they would avoid it until engineers could investigate. If he recommended extra safety precautions for a particular shift, everyone followed his guidance without question. In 20 years of working under Thomas's supervision, his crew had never experienced a serious accident. But in the summer of 1947, Thomas started having dreams about a massive mine collapse that would trap him and his crew on level 7 of the mine. These weren't the typical anxiety dreams that many miners experienced, dreams about cave-ins, gas explosions, or getting lost in the tunnels. Thomas had been having those kinds of dreams for years, and he understood them as his mind processing the natural fears that came with working underground. These new dreams were different. They were specific, detailed, and so vivid that Thomas would wake up feeling like he had actually experienced the disaster. In his dream, he could hear the exact groaning sound the support beams would make before they failed. A deep, metallic creaking that would start softly and then build to a crescendo just before the collapse. Thomas described this sound in his diary as like the mountain itself crying out in pain. He had heard timber supports failing before during his career, but the sound in his dreams was different, deeper, more resonant, as if the failure was happening on a much larger scale than anything he had experienced. In the dream, Thomas could feel the vibration in the ground that would precede the cave-in. It wasn't the sharp, sudden shock of an explosion or the rhythmic pounding of mining equipment. Instead, it was a slow, rolling tremor that seemed to move through the rock like a wave, getting stronger and more ominous as it approached. Thomas also dreamed about the specific smell that would fill the air when the cave-in occurred. It was a mixture of coal dust, crushed rock, and something else, something organic and earthy that he couldn't quite identify but that filled him with dread. Years later, survivors would describe the smell exactly as Thomas had dreamed it, the scent of ancient earth being disturbed, of rock formations that had been stable for millions of years suddenly shifting and breaking apart. The most disturbing part of Thomas's recurring dream was his ability to see exactly which areas of level 7 would be affected by the collapse. He dreamed about specific support pillars failing in a particular sequence, about certain tunnels being completely blocked while others remained partially accessible. He could visualize the exact pattern of debris that would result from the cave-in, and he knew which escape routes would be blocked and which might remain open. Thomas had been working level 7 for over a decade, and he knew every inch of those tunnels. In his dream, he could see the collapse happening in slow motion, watching as sections of the ceiling gave way in a domino effect, as tons of rock crashed down to fill the spaces where he and his men worked every day. But what made these dreams truly prophetic was Thomas's ability to see the human element of the disaster. He dreamed about specific members of his crew and how they would react when the cave-in began. He saw young Jimmy Sullivan, who had only been working in the mines for 6 months, panicking and running toward a tunnel that would be the first to collapse. He saw veteran miner Pete Kowalski attempting to shore up a failing support beam with his bare hands, trying to buy time for others to escape. Thomas also dreamed about his own actions during the disaster. He saw himself making split-second decisions about which men to send toward which escape routes, how to prioritize rescue efforts, and where to position himself to have the best chance of coordinating survival efforts. In the dream, Thomas was calm and focused despite the chaos around him, drawing on his decades of experience to make the best decisions possible under impossible circumstances. The psychological impact of these dreams on Thomas was profound. He had always been a confident, decisive leader, but the recurring visions of disaster began to affect his behavior during his waking hours. He started conducting more frequent safety inspections of Level 7, looking for any signs of the problems he had seen in his dreams. Thomas began documenting everything in his daily reports with unusual detail. He noted minor changes in the sound of the support beams, variations in air quality, and subtle shifts in the rock formations that might indicate instability. His supervisors at the mining company initially appreciated his increased attention to safety, but they began to worry when his reports became increasingly concerned about problems that their engineers couldn't detect. The mining company was under pressure to meet production quotas. Coal demand was high in post-war America, and the owners were focused on maximizing output rather than investigating vague safety concerns that couldn't be verified through normal inspection procedures. When Thomas requested that Level 7 be temporarily closed for additional safety assessments, his request was denied. Thomas tried to explain his concerns to the mine superintendent, describing the specific dangers he had seen in his dreams. But talking about prophetic dreams in the context of industrial safety was not something that mining companies in 1947 were equipped to handle. The superintendent listened politely to Thomas's concerns, but dismissed them as the anxieties of a man who had been working underground for too long. "Thomas," the superintendent said, "you're one of our best foremen, but you can't shut down a profitable operation because of nightmares. Level 7 has been operating safely for 15 years. Our engineers have inspected it thoroughly, and they haven't found any structural problems that would justify closing it down." Thomas found himself in an impossible position. He couldn't abandon his responsibility to his crew, but he also couldn't convince his supervisors to take his prophetic dreams seriously. He decided to try a different approach. Instead of talking about his dreams, he would focus on preparing his men for the disaster he believed was coming. Thomas began conducting more frequent safety drills with his crew, practicing emergency procedures and escape routes with an intensity that surprised the other miners. He made sure every man knew the locations of all emergency equipment, and he created detailed plans for how to respond to various types of disasters. He also started assigning work duties in ways that would minimize the number of men in the most dangerous areas he had seen in his dreams. What's really tragic about Thomas's story is that he tried to save his crew along with himself. On the morning of what would be their final shift, Thomas gathered his men and told them about his dreams. He didn't present it as superstition or folklore. He talked about it as information that might help them survive if something went wrong. "I've been having dreams about a cave-in on Level 7, Thomas told his crew. "I don't know if dreams mean anything, but I know this mine better than anyone, and something feels wrong to me. I want you all to be extra careful today. Stay alert, watch for any signs of trouble, and if I tell you to evacuate, don't ask questions, just move." The response from his crew was mixed. Some of the younger miners were skeptical about taking safety precautions based on dreams, but the veterans who had worked with Thomas for years knew to trust his instincts. Several miners approached Thomas privately and asked for specific advice about how to stay safe if his dreams proved accurate. Thomas spent the day positioning his men strategically, keeping the most experienced miners in areas where they would be most likely to survive if a collapse occurred. He also made sure that emergency equipment was distributed throughout Level 7, so that rescue efforts could begin immediately if disaster struck. The mine collapse happened exactly as Thomas had dreamed. Level 7 caved in during the afternoon shift, trapping Thomas and 6 other miners under tons of rock. The sound, the vibration, the smell, everything matched his prophetic visions with uncanny accuracy. The collapse occurred in the exact sequence he had foreseen, affecting the specific areas he had identified in his dreams. But Thomas's preparations made a difference. Because he had warned his crew and positioned them strategically, only 7 men were trapped instead of the usual crew of 15. The miners who had listened to Thomas's warnings had requested transfers to different areas of the mine or had called in sick that day. His safety drills had prepared the remaining crew members to respond quickly and effectively when the disaster occurred. Rescue crews worked for 3 days trying to reach the trapped miners. The cave-in was so extensive that normal rescue procedures were impossible. The usual access routes were completely blocked. and the instability of the surrounding rock made it dangerous for rescue workers to use heavy equipment. Thomas and his crew survived for nearly 72 hours in the trapped section of the mine. They had access to a small pocket of air and some emergency supplies that Thomas had strategically positioned based on his dreams. The men later said that Thomas remained calm and focused throughout the ordeal, using his knowledge of the mine's layout to find the safest possible location for them to wait for rescue. The really heartbreaking part is that they found Thomas's helmet with a note he had scratched into the metal. "I saw this coming, tried to warn everyone. Take care of the families." Thomas Brennan died exactly as he had dreamed, but he'd managed to save half his crew by convincing them to stay away from Level 7 that day. Thomas's story became part of mining folklore in Pennsylvania. His ability to predict a disaster through dreams, combined with his successful efforts to minimize the casualties, made him a legend among coal miners throughout the region. Many miners began paying more attention to their own dreams and intuitions about safety, and some mining companies started taking worker concerns more seriously, even when they seemed to be based on non-rational sources. The investigation into the Level 7 collapse revealed that the disaster had been caused by a combination of factors that would have been nearly impossible to predict through normal engineering assessments. Underground water had gradually weakened support structures over a period of months, creating instabilities that became critical during the exact time period Thomas had foreseen in his dreams. Thomas's widow, Mary Brennan, kept his diary with its detailed descriptions of his prophetic dreams. She eventually donated it to the Pennsylvania Mining Heritage Foundation, where it became part of an exhibit about mining safety and the importance of listening to experienced workers' concerns about potential dangers. The Thomas Brennan case is still studied by industrial safety experts as an example of how individual workers' intuitive understanding of their workplace environment can sometimes provide warnings about disasters that formal safety procedures might miss. His story suggests that prophetic dreams might sometimes serve as early warning systems, allowing people to take protective action even when they can't fully understand or explain the source of their concerns. Years later, mining safety protocols were changed to include more systematic attention to worker safety concerns, even when those concerns couldn't be immediately verified through engineering analysis. Thomas's story contributed to a broader understanding that workplace safety depends not just on technical knowledge, but also on the accumulated wisdom and intuitive understanding of experienced workers who spend their lives in dangerous environments. The Level 7 disaster also led to improved emergency response procedures in Pennsylvania mines. The strategic positioning of emergency equipment and the practice of conducting regular safety drills, innovations that Thomas had implemented based on his prophetic dreams, became standard practices throughout the industry. Thomas Brennan died trying to save his crew, but his legacy lived on in the improved safety measures that his experience helped to create. His prophetic dreams had shown him not just his own fate, but ways to minimize the tragedy and protect the lives of his fellow miners. Sometimes the most important thing about seeing the future isn't avoiding your own destiny, it's using that knowledge to help others survive the disasters that can't be prevented. Our last secondary story takes us to 1962, to the Grand Hotel in San Francisco, where a traveling businessman named Arthur Morrison was staying during a 3-day conference. Arthur was a perfectly ordinary guy, sold insurance, had a wife and 2 kids back in Ohio, probably never had a paranormal experience in his life. Picture this man. Arthur wasn't someone you'd expect to have prophetic dreams. He was what people in the 1960s called a company man, reliable, practical, focused on quarterly sales figures and maintaining good relationships with clients. He wore conservative suits, carried a briefcase that his wife had given him for their 10th wedding anniversary, and believed in hard work, honest dealing, and the American dream of steady progress through dedication. Arthur had been traveling for business for over 15 years, staying in hotels from coast to coast as he built relationships with insurance agencies and expanded his company's market reach. He'd slept in hundreds of different beds, from luxury establishments in major cities to modest motor lodges in small towns. Hotel rooms were just temporary workspaces to him, places to make phone calls, review contracts, and get a good night's sleep before the next day's meetings. The Grand Hotel in San Francisco was one of the nicer places Arthur had stayed. It was an elegant establishment built in the 1920s with marble floors in the lobby, crystal chandeliers, and the kind of old-world service that made business travelers feel important and well cared for. Arthur's room on the 7th floor had a beautiful view of the city, comfortable furniture, and all the amenities a practical businessman could want. Arthur had been looking forward to this particular trip because the conference was being held by his company's Western Regional Office, and it would give him a chance to meet colleagues he'd only corresponded with by telephone and letter. The insurance industry was changing rapidly in the early 1960s, with new technologies and marketing approaches that required face-to-face discussion and planning. On his second night at the hotel, Arthur had an incredibly vivid dream that was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. In the dream, he found himself lying in his hotel bed, but everything about the room felt wrong. Somehow, the air was thick and hard to breathe. There was an acrid smell that reminded him of the chemistry lab from his college days, and he could hear a sound like wind rushing through a tunnel. In the dream, Arthur woke up from sleep, though he was already dreaming, and tried to get out of bed to investigate the strange sensations. But as he sat up, he realized that the room was filled with a thin, grayish smoke that seemed to be seeping in through the ventilation system and around the edges of the door. The smoke had a chemical smell that burned his throat and made his eyes water. Arthur's dream was remarkably specific about the sequence of events that would follow. He saw himself getting out of bed and going to the window, hoping to open it for fresh air, but discovering that the window was painted shut, something he hadn't noticed during his waking hours in the room. He tried using a chair to break the glass, but the window was too thick and the chair wasn't heavy enough to shatter it effectively. In the nightmare, Arthur could hear sounds from other rooms and the hallway outside, people coughing, voices calling out in confusion and alarm, and the sound of footsteps running back and forth in the corridors. He realized that whatever was happening wasn't limited to his room, but was affecting the entire floor or possibly the whole hotel. The most terrifying part of Arthur's dream was his growing realization that he was trapped. In the nightmare, he tried to leave his room, but when he opened the door, the hallway was filled with thick, choking smoke that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. He could hear other guests calling for help, but he couldn't locate them or find his way to the stairwells that would lead to safety. Arthur dreamed about trying to crawl along the hallway floor, where the air was slightly clearer, feeling his way along the walls and searching for exit signs or stairwell doors, but the smoke continued to thicken, and he found himself becoming disoriented and confused about which direction he was facing and how far he'd traveled from his room. In the dream, Arthur's breathing became increasingly labored as the smoke filled his lungs. He experienced the specific sensation of smoke inhalation, the burning in his throat, the way his chest felt tight and constricted, the growing weakness as his body struggled to get enough oxygen. The dream was so realistic that he could feel his heart beating faster as his body went into distress. The nightmare always ended the same way, with Arthur collapsing in the hotel hallway, unable to breathe or continue searching for an exit. He would lose consciousness in the dream while still hearing the sounds of other people calling for help, emergency sirens in the distance and the crackling sound of flames somewhere in the building. When Arthur woke up from this dream, he was gasping and sweating, his heart pounding as if he'd actually been running for his life. The dream had been so vivid and realistic that for several minutes, he wasn't sure whether he was still dreaming or safely awake in his hotel room. He got up and checked the door, the window, and the ventilation system, trying to reassure himself that everything was normal. But Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that the dream had been more than just his. Imagination processing fears about hotel safety. The details had been too specific, too technically accurate, and too emotionally intense for a routine anxiety dream. He dreamed about specific aspects of smoke behavior, building layout, and emergency response that went far beyond his normal knowledge or experience. The dream was so disturbing that Arthur seriously considered checking out of the hotel and finding different accommodations for the remainder of his conference. But it was conference season in San Francisco, and every decent hotel was booked solid. The conference organizers had specifically reserved blocks of rooms at the Grand Hotel, and changing his accommodation would have meant either staying at a much less convenient location or potentially missing important meetings. Arthur tried to rationalize his fears by telling himself that the Grand Hotel was a well-established, professionally managed facility with modern safety systems. The building had been renovated several times since the 1920s, and he assumed that fire safety equipment and procedures would meet current standards. He reminded himself that he'd stayed in dozens of similar hotels without incident, and that letting a nightmare control his business decisions would be both irrational and potentially damaging to his career. Still, Arthur found himself paying unusual attention to safety details that he'd normally ignore. He located the fire exits on his floor, counted the number of doors between his room and the nearest stairwell, and tested his window to see if it would open easily. When he discovered that the window was indeed painted shut, just as he dreamed, Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with San Francisco's evening air. Arthur spent his final day at the conference distracted and nervous, finding it difficult to concentrate on presentations and networking conversations. His colleagues noticed that he seemed unusually preoccupied, and several people asked if he was feeling well or if there were problems at home. Arthur made vague excuses about not sleeping well, but he couldn't bring himself to explain the real source of his anxiety. That evening, Arthur had dinner with several colleagues at the hotel restaurant, trying to maintain normal social interactions despite his growing sense of unease. He found himself studying the hotel's layout more carefully, noticing details about the electrical systems, the kitchen ventilation, and the age of various building components that suggested the facility might not be as modern or well-maintained as its elegant appearance suggested. Around 10 p.m., Arthur excused himself from the group and returned to his room, planning to pack his belongings and prepare for an early departure the next morning. He was looking forward to returning home to Ohio, where he could put his strange San Francisco experience behind him and get back to his normal routine of family life and familiar work environments. Arthur fell asleep sometime after midnight, despite his anxiety about the possibility of having another nightmare. But this time, his sleep was peaceful and undisturbed. No dreams about fires, smoke, or trapped hotel guests. He woke up naturally around 6 a.m., feeling rested and somewhat embarrassed about his previous day's paranoia. But at 2:47 a.m., while Arthur was sleeping peacefully, a grease fire started in the hotel kitchen, located directly below the guest room floors. The fire began when an automatic cleaning cycle in one of the industrial ovens malfunctioned, igniting accumulated grease and food residue that hadn't been properly cleaned from the equipment. The hotel's fire suppression system in the kitchen was outdated and insufficient to contain a fire of this intensity. The flames spread rapidly through the kitchen and into the building's ventilation system, which had been designed in the 1920s without modern fire safety considerations. The ventilation ducts acted like a highway system for smoke and toxic gases, distributing them throughout the upper floors of the hotel faster than anyone had anticipated. By 3:15 a.m., the 7th floor, where Arthur was staying, was filled with thick, choking smoke that seeped into guest rooms through the ventilation system and around door frames, exactly as Arthur had experienced in his prophetic dream. Hotel guests began waking up to the smell of smoke and the sound of fire alarms, but by then, the hallways were already too smoke-filled for safe evacuation. Arthur Morrison was found in the hallway outside his room, having died from smoke inhalation, while trying to escape through conditions that perfectly matched his nightmare vision. The window in his room was indeed painted shut, and there was evidence that he had tried unsuccessfully to break the glass using a chair from his hotel room furniture. The fire department investigation revealed that Arthur had made it farther down the hallway than most other guests on his floor, suggesting that he had responded to the emergency more quickly and effectively than people who hadn't had advance warning through prophetic dreams. He had been found near one of the stairwell entrances, indicating that he'd been moving in the right direction and might have escaped if the smoke conditions had been slightly less severe. 12 people died in the Grand Hotel fire, including Arthur and 5 other guests on the 7th floor. The disaster led to significant changes in San Francisco's fire safety codes, particularly regarding hotel ventilation systems and emergency evacuation procedures. The specific problems that had made the fire so deadly, the outdated ventilation design and the painted shut windows, were exactly the hazards that Arthur had identified in his prophetic dream. Arthur's wife, Helen, was devastated by his death, but she was also disturbed by the circumstances that had led to it. When she went through his belongings after the funeral, she found notes he had written about his nightmare, including detailed descriptions of the hotel layout, smoke behavior, and evacuation difficulties that proved to be remarkably accurate predictions of how the actual fire would unfold. Helen kept Arthur's notes about his prophetic dream, and years later, she donated them to a research project studying precognitive experiences related to disasters. Arthur's case became one of the most well-documented examples of someone having detailed prophetic dreams about their own death in a specific disaster. The really heartbreaking aspect of Arthur's story is that his prophetic dream had been accurate enough to potentially save his life. But the practical circumstances of his business trip had made it impossible for him to act effectively on the warning his subconscious had provided. He'd been trapped between his rational understanding that the dream was probably just anxiety and his intuitive sense that it represented a real danger. Arthur Morrison died exactly as he had dreamed, from smoke inhalation in a hotel fire, after trying unsuccessfully to escape through smoke-filled hallways while other guests called for help around him. His prophetic dream had shown him not just his own fate, but the precise mechanism by which a routine business trip would become a deadly disaster. What makes Arthur's story particularly poignant is how it demonstrates that prophetic dreams don't always provide opportunities to avoid tragedy. Sometimes they seem to serve as preparations for inevitable events, allowing people to face their fate with whatever dignity and courage they can summon, rather than being caught completely off guard by disasters they never saw coming. Arthur's experience suggests that some prophetic dreams might be less about changing the future and more about helping people understand their place in events that are already unfolding according to patterns we can't control or completely comprehend. Throughout human history, people have struggled to understand dreams that seem to predict the future, especially dreams about death. And the explanations they've come up with are, well, let's just say they're as varied as they are fascinating, and they tell us almost as much about the cultures that created them as they do about the dreams themselves. In ancient Egypt, prophetic dreams were considered direct communications from the gods, not just any gods, but specific deities who had particular relationships with individual dreamers. The Egyptians developed an incredibly sophisticated system for understanding these divine messages, one that was far more complex than most people realize. If someone dreamed their own death, it was seen as the gods preparing their soul for transition to the afterlife. But it wasn't just a simple warning. Egyptian priests believed that the more vivid and detailed the dream, the more honor the gods were showing the dreamer by giving them advance warning. It was considered a sign of divine favor to receive such specific information about your own mortality. The Egyptians also believed that some people were naturally better at receiving these divine messages than others. They identified individuals who had particularly accurate prophetic dreams and gave them special roles as dream interpreters in temples and royal courts. These weren't just fortune tellers or entertainers. They were considered to have a direct line to divine knowledge, and their interpretations could influence major political and military decisions. What's really interesting is that Egyptian dream interpreters developed what might be the world's first systematic approach to understanding prophetic dreams. They kept detailed records of people's dreams and their outcomes, essentially creating an ancient database of prophetic accuracy that they used to refine their interpretation methods over generations. Some of these papyrus records still exist today, and they show surprisingly sophisticated attempts to find patterns in when and why certain dreams come true. The Egyptians noticed that prophetic dreams often occurred during times of personal crisis or major life transitions, and they developed specific rituals and practices designed to either encourage or prevent these divine communications, depending on what the dreamer needed. Pace slowing even more, moving to ancient Greece, philosophers like Aristotle had a completely different take on prophetic dreams. one that was remarkably similar to some modern psychological theories. Aristotle believed that our minds are constantly processing subtle information, that our conscious awareness misses tiny changes in people's behavior, environmental cues, social patterns that indicate coming events. According to Aristotelian theory, prophetic dreams weren't supernatural at all. They were just our subconscious minds assembling all these subtle clues into coherent predictions while we slept. So when someone like Abraham Lincoln dreamed about his assassination, it wasn't divine revelation. It was his brain recognizing the growing political tensions, security risks, and social instability that made such an event increasingly likely. This theory is actually pretty close to some modern psychological thinking about intuition and subconscious processing. Maybe some people are just naturally better at picking up on subtle environmental cues that indicate danger or change. Their dreams might be their subconscious mind's way of processing this information and presenting it in a form that their conscious minds can understand and act upon. Greek philosophers also noticed that prophetic dreams often occurred in people who were under extreme stress or facing major life challenges. They theorized that crisis situations might heighten our sensitivity to subtle environmental cues, making us more likely to pick up on information that we would normally miss. This could explain why so many prophetic death dreams occur during wartime, periods of social upheaval, or times of personal crisis. Continuing to slow down, medieval European culture had its own interpretation of prophetic death dreams, and it was, well, pretty dark, even by medieval standards. The Catholic Church taught that dreams about your own death were either temptations from demons trying to create despair, or they were genuine visions sent by God to encourage repentance and spiritual preparation. Medieval dream interpreters developed elaborate systems for distinguishing between demonic false visions and divine true prophecies. They believed that dreams sent by God would feel peaceful and purposeful, even if their content was disturbing. The dreamer would wake up feeling prepared and spiritually strengthened, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Demonic dreams, on the other hand, would feel chaotic and create overwhelming fear or despair. They were designed to paralyze the dreamer with terror, preventing them from taking positive action or seeking spiritual comfort. Medieval priests developed specific prayers and rituals for protecting against demonic dream influences, and they taught people to analyze their emotional responses to dreams as a way of determining their spiritual source. What's fascinating is that medieval people took prophetic dreams so seriously that some monasteries kept dream journals, where monks recorded and analyzed their dreams for spiritual significance. These journals show that medieval people had remarkably sophisticated ideas about the psychology of dreams, even though they explained everything in religious terms. Medieval dream interpreters also noticed that prophetic dreams often seemed to serve a larger purpose beyond just warning the individual dreamer. They believed that God sometimes gave people prophetic dreams not to save them from death, but to prepare them to face death in a way that would serve the greater good. This idea that prophetic dreams might be about spiritual preparation rather than physical survival became central to medieval Christian thinking about divine visions. Slower still, more contemplative, moving into more recent history, the 19th century brought the rise of spiritualism and scientific interest in paranormal phenomena. During this period, organizations like the Society for Psychical Research started collecting and analyzing accounts of prophetic dreams with something approaching modern scientific methodology. These Victorian researchers were the first to try to distinguish between coincidence and genuine precognitive experiences using systematic data collection and statistical analysis. They developed criteria for evaluating prophetic dreams. The dream had to be recorded before the predicted event, had to include specific details that couldn't be reasonably guessed, and had to come true in a way that matched the dream closely enough to rule out chance. What they found was actually pretty surprising. When they applied rigorous standards, they still found a small but consistent number of cases that seemed to involve genuine precognitive dreams. Not many, maybe one in several thousand reported cases, but enough to suggest that something unusual was occasionally happening. That couldn't be explained by coincidence or fraud. The Victorian researchers also noticed that prophetic dreams seem to occur more frequently during times of social upheaval or personal crisis. They theorized that extreme stress might somehow enhance people's sensitivity to information that exists outside normal temporal boundaries. This led to some of the first scientific theories about how precognitive experiences might actually work. Victorian spiritualists also developed the idea that some people might be naturally more sensitive to precognitive information than others. They identified individuals who seemed to have unusually accurate prophetic dreams and studied them extensively, trying to understand what made them different from the general population. Very slow pace now, almost hypnotic. Modern neuroscience has given us new ways to think about prophetic dreams, though we're still far from understanding them completely. We now know that during sleep, especially during REM stages, our brains are incredibly active in processing memories, emotions, and sensory information in ways that can produce remarkably creative and intuitive insights. Some researchers theorize that prophetic dreams might result from our brains, remarkable pattern recognition abilities working on information we're not consciously aware of. Your brain might notice subtle changes in someone's health, behavior, or environment and project those patterns forward to their logical conclusions while you sleep. This could explain why some prophetic dreams seem to predict events that are actually the result of gradual processes rather than sudden, unpredictable occurrences. There's also the possibility that our perception of time isn't as fixed as we think it is. Some physicists and consciousness researchers suggest that during certain altered states, including some types of dreaming, our awareness might occasionally access information from outside our normal temporal boundaries. This is still highly speculative, but it's based on legitimate scientific theories about the nature of time and consciousness. Modern sleep research has also revealed that our brains are far more active during sleep than scientists previously understood. We now know that sleep isn't just a passive state of rest, but an active process where our brains are consolidating memories, processing emotions, and making connections between seemingly unrelated pieces of information. This enhanced neural activity might sometimes produce insights that seem prophetic, but are actually the result of advanced pattern recognition working on subconscious information. Continuing very slow pace, but here's what I find most fascinating about all these historical and scientific attempts to explain prophetic dreams. None of them really capture the lived experience of having one. When you read accounts from people like Abraham Lincoln or the Titanic engineer, there's something about the quality of these dreams that seems fundamentally different from normal dreaming or even enhanced pattern recognition. People who've had genuine prophetic dreams almost always describe them as feeling more real than real. They report sensory details that are impossibly vivid, emotional responses that are overwhelming, and a sense of certainty that what they're experiencing will actually happen. It's like the difference between watching a movie and being inside the events themselves. Most dreams, even vivid ones, have a kind of fuzzy, symbolic quality that makes them feel obviously dreamlike when we remember them. But prophetic dreams seem to have a clarity and specificity that's almost documentary-like. The dreamers can remember exact conversations, specific physical details, and precise sequences of events with an accuracy that normal dreams rarely achieve. This suggests that prophetic dreams might involve a different type of consciousness or awareness than normal dreaming. Some researchers have proposed that these experiences might represent a temporary expansion of consciousness that allows access to information that exists outside normal space-time boundaries. Very contemplative now, different cultures have also developed various practices for either encouraging or preventing prophetic dreams. Some Native American traditions include specific rituals for dream quests, where individuals seek visions of future events through fasting, meditation, and spiritual preparation. These practices are based on the belief that prophetic dreams can be actively sought and controlled, rather than just passively received. Other cultures have developed elaborate protective practices designed to prevent unwanted prophetic visions. Some traditional Chinese medicine practices include specific herbs and meditation techniques that are believed to block prophetic dreams. Based on the understanding that this type of knowledge can be psychologically harmful if the dreamer isn't prepared to handle it. What's interesting is that across cultures, there seems to be an understanding that prophetic dreams often come with a psychological cost. People who regularly have accurate prophetic dreams frequently report feeling burdened by knowledge they can't act on, or traumatized by experiencing their own or others' deaths repeatedly in their dreams. There's also the question of whether prophetic dreams serve any evolutionary purpose. If some humans occasionally have access to future information, why would natural selection preserve this ability? Some researchers suggest that precognitive dreams might have helped our ancestors avoid dangers or prepare for seasonal changes, giving them survival advantages that outweighed the psychological costs. Extremely slow, reflective pace, the more you study prophetic dreams throughout history, the more you realize how little we really understand about consciousness, time, and the relationship between mind and reality. We can measure brainwaves during sleep, we can analyze the biochemistry of dreaming, we can study the psychology of pattern recognition, but we still can't explain why some people occasionally wake up with accurate information about events that haven't happened yet. Maybe that's okay. Maybe some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious. Maybe prophetic dreams exist at the intersection of consciousness and reality in ways that our current scientific understanding isn't equipped to explain, and maybe that's exactly as it should be. What we do know is that throughout human history, in every culture and time period, some people have reported dreams that later came true with remarkable accuracy. The stories are too consistent, too widespread, and sometimes too well documented to dismiss entirely. They represent a persistent aspect of human experience that transcends cultural boundaries and historical periods. Whether these dreams represent genuine precognitive abilities, enhanced pattern recognition, or something else entirely, they remind us that consciousness itself is still largely mysterious. We don't fully understand how our brains create subjective experience, how memory works, or how we process information during sleep. Prophetic dreams might be just one example of capabilities that our consciousness possesses, but that we haven't yet learned to understand or control. And that brings us to some of the more obscure cases, the prophetic death dreams that most people have never heard about, but that are just as unsettling as the famous ones. Before we drift off into whatever dreams await us tonight, let me share a few lesser-known stories about prophetic death dreams that somehow slipped through the cracks of recorded history, cases that are just as unsettling as the famous ones, but that most people have never heard about. The Siberian shaman's final vision in the winter of 1889. In a remote village called Verkhnudinsk in Siberia, there lived a shaman named Yekaterina Voronova, who was known throughout the region for her ability to communicate with spirits and predict important events for her community. But Yekaterina started having a recurring dream that was different from her usual spiritual visions, different in ways that would prove to be terrifyingly prophetic. Yekaterina was what the local people called a dream walker, someone who could deliberately enter the spirit realm through controlled dreaming and bring back information that would help her community survive the harsh realities of Siberian life. She had been serving as the village's spiritual guide for over 30 years, helping families communicate with deceased relatives, predicting weather patterns that would affect hunting and farming, and providing guidance during times of crisis. But this new dream was unlike anything in Yekaterina's decades of spiritual practice. In this vision, she saw herself dying during the spring thaw, not from illness, accident, or any of the usual dangers that claimed lives in remote Siberian villages. Instead, she dreamed of dying from what she described as the earth swallowing me whole, a fate that seemed to make no sense in the context of her daily life. In her dream, Yekaterina saw herself standing on what appeared to be solid ground near the frozen river that provided water for her village. The ground looked perfectly normal, covered with the typical spring mixture of snow, ice, and emerging grass that marked the end of the brutal Siberian winter. But in the dream, this apparently stable surface would suddenly collapse beneath her feet, dropping her into an underground cavern filled with rushing water that had been carved out by the spring melt. What made this dream particularly disturbing was how Yekaterina described the sensation of falling. She wrote in her journal, one of the few written records left by Siberian shamans of that era, that she could feel herself dropping through solid earth as if it were water, could hear the sound of ancient rock formations cracking and shifting, could smell the mineral-rich scent of underground water that had been trapped in darkness for centuries. Yekaterina told her village about this dream and warned them to stay away from the riverbank during the spring melt. But she seemed to know that she herself wouldn't be able to avoid her fate. She spent the winter of 1889 preparing her successor, a young woman named Anya, who had been showing signs of spiritual sensitivity, and teaching her all of the shamanic knowledge that had been passed down through generations of spiritual guides. The villagers later said that Yekaterina's behavior during that final winter was unusual even for someone who regularly communicated with spirits. She seemed to be preparing for a departure that she couldn't prevent, giving away personal possessions, sharing family stories that she had never told before, and conducting spiritual ceremonies that felt more like farewell rituals than routine seasonal observances. When spring came to Verkhnudinsk in 1889, the fall was more dramatic than usual. Decades of accumulated snow and ice melted rapidly, creating flooding conditions that exceeded anything in local memory. The river that had been frozen solid for months suddenly became a raging torrent, carrying away debris and carving new channels through the landscape. Yekaterina was found exactly as she dreamed, fallen through what appeared to be solid, ground into an underground cavern that had been carved out by spring meltwater. The ground had looked perfectly stable, but underground erosion had created a hidden void that collapsed under her weight. No one else in the village had any idea such caverns existed beneath the riverbank, and later investigation revealed a complex network of underground water channels that had been developing for years without any visible surface indication. The Confederate soldiers' Christmas dream during the American Civil War. In December of 1863, a Confederate soldier named James Edward Whitaker wrote a letter to his wife, Martha, describing a dream he'd had about Christmas Day that would prove to be unnaturally prophetic. James was a private in the 15th Alabama Infantry Regiment, and he had been fighting in the war for nearly 2 years without experiencing anything that might be considered supernatural or otherworldly. James came from a small farming community near Mobile, Alabama, where he had worked as a blacksmith before the war. He was what people in the 1860s would have called a practical man, someone who dealt with tangible problems and solutions, who understood the physical world through direct experience rather than abstract thinking. He'd never shown any interest in spiritualism, fortune-telling, or the kind of mystical experiences that some soldiers reported during the stress of wartime. But James's dream about Christmas Day 1863 was so vivid and specific that he felt compelled to write about it in detail to his wife. In the dream, he saw himself being shot by a Union sniper while delivering a message between Confederate positions near Chattanooga, Tennessee. The dream wasn't just about dying in combat. It included precise details about the location, the circumstances, and the exact sequence of events that would lead to his death. James described the exact location where he would be shot, near a damaged church with a bell tower that had been partially destroyed by artillery fire. The church was a real building that James had seen during his military service, but in his dream he could see it with clarity that exceeded his normal memory of the place. He described the specific pattern of damage to the bell tower, the way the church's front door had been blown off its hinges, and the particular configuration of debris that surrounded the building. In his dream, James saw himself running between the church and a line of Confederate trenches when a single rifle shot would hit him in the chest. He described the exact trajectory of the bullet, the specific sound it would make when it struck him, and the way he would fall backward into the snow that had been accumulating around the church since early December. What made James's dream particularly chilling was his description of his own death experience. He wrote to Martha that he could feel the bullet pierce his chest, could sense his lungs filling with blood, could experience the gradual weakening of his heartbeat as his life drained away. He described lying in the snow, looking up at the winter sky, and feeling snowflakes landing on his face as his consciousness faded. "I know this sounds like the imagination of a tired soldier," James wrote to Martha, "but this dream felt different from all the others. I could feel the cold air, smell the gunpowder, even hear the specific sound the bullet made when it hit me. I could taste the blood in my mouth and feel the snow melting against my skin as I died. I pray it was just a nightmare, but something tells me it was more than that. James's letter provided details that would later prove to be unnaturally accurate. He predicted that he would be shot during the afternoon of December 25th, while carrying dispatches from his company commander to an artillery position about half a mile away. He described the exact route he would take, the specific type of message he would be carrying, and even the identity of the Union sniper who would kill him, a sharpshooter from an Ohio regiment who had been targeting Confederate messengers for several days. On Christmas Day, 1863, James was indeed shot by a Union sniper while carrying dispatches near the damaged church outside Chattanooga. According to witnesses, he was found lying in the snow, having died from a single bullet wound to the chest, just as he'd dreamed. The snow was falling exactly as he had described, and his body was positioned in the same way he had seen in his prophetic vision, the fisherman's storm vision in 1901, on a small island called Gull Rock off the coast of Maine. An old fisherman named Tobias Gray had been working the same waters for 40 years without serious incident. Tobias was what coastal people called a weather reader, someone who could predict storms, tides, and fishing conditions with accuracy that seemed almost supernatural, but was actually based on decades of careful observation and intuitive understanding of oceanic patterns. Tobias lived alone on Gull Rock, in a small cottage that he had built himself from driftwood and salvaged materials. The island was barely 2 acres in size, with no permanent residents except for Tobias and the seabirds that gave the place its name. He made his living by fishing the waters around the island and selling his catch to buyers who came out from the mainland, once a week to collect seafood for restaurants in Portland and Boston. But in late September 1901, Tobias started having dreams about dying in a storm that would hit the Maine coast with unprecedented fury. The dream was unusual because Tobias had experienced countless storms during his 4 decades of coastal living, and he had never been seriously threatened by weather conditions that he couldn't predict and prepare for. In his dream, Tobias saw massive waves, higher than any he'd ever experienced in real life, overwhelming his small fishing boat. But the unusual detail was that in the dream, he wasn't alone. He saw himself trying to rescue a young boy who had somehow ended up in the water during the storm, a child who had no connection to his normal daily life on the isolated island. What made this dream particularly puzzling was that Tobias always fished alone by choice and by necessity. There weren't any children on Gull Rock, and the island was too remote and dangerous for families with young children to visit. The dream seemed to make no sense in the context of his actual life, which was why it disturbed him so much. Tobias dreamed that he would save the boy's life but drown in the process, pulled underwater by waves that exceeded anything in his experience of Maine coastal conditions. He described the storm in his diary as not like any weather I've seen in 40 years of working these waters, a tempest that would bring wind speeds, and wave heights that would redefine what was considered possible for North Atlantic storms. When the hurricane hit the Maine coast in October 1901, it brought with it a refugee boat carrying families who were fleeing economic hardship in the maritime provinces of Canada. The boat was a small vessel that had been overloaded with people and supplies, and it was completely unsuited for the severe weather conditions that the storm created. The boat was overwhelmed by the hurricane while passing near Gull Rock, breaking apart in waves that exceeded anything in recorded Maine maritime history. Tobias saw a young boy struggling in the massive waves and immediately launched his fishing boat to attempt a rescue, knowing that the conditions were far beyond what his small vessel could handle safely. Tobias managed to pull the boy to safety, but was swept overboard by a wave that witnesses described as higher than a church steeple. He drowned exactly as he had dreamed, saving the life of a child he'd never met, during a storm that brought weather conditions that exceeded anything in local maritime records. The boy he saved, a 10-year-old named Robert Mackenzie, grew up to become a doctor and spent his life working in coastal communities throughout Maine and the maritime provinces. He always credited the old fisherman who had dreamed of his own death in order to save a stranger's child, and he kept a photograph of Tobias Gray in his medical office for his entire career. These stories remind us that prophetic dreams often seem to be less about personal fate and more about the mysterious ways our lives intersect with others. The shaman who dreamed of geological dangers that would claim her life but warn her community. The soldier who dreamed of wartime tragedy but faced it with courage and dignity. The fisherman who dreamed of saving a stranger's child even at the cost of his own life. All of their prophetic visions involved circumstances that were far beyond their individual control, but that connected them to larger patterns of meaning and purpose. Maybe that's what prophetic death dreams are really about, not just personal destiny, but the strange way consciousness sometimes reaches across time to prepare us for moments when our individual stories become part of something larger than ourselves. If you're somehow still awake, which honestly would surprise me at this point, you've just experienced some of the most unsettling and fascinating prophetic dream stories in recorded history. These accounts of people who dreamed their own deaths before living them raise questions that we still can't answer. Are these dreams glimpses of predetermined fate? Warnings that went unheeded? Or something else entirely, our consciousness occasionally stepping outside the normal flow of time to gather information we're not supposed to have? I'd love to know what you think about these stories. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from tonight. And, well, if you've ever had a dream that felt too real, too specific, too prophetic for comfort, though maybe save those details until morning, no need to give the rest of us nightmares. The truth is, we may never understand why some people are given these glimpses of future events, especially tragic ones. But maybe understanding isn't the point. Maybe these stories exist to remind us that consciousness, time, and reality are far more mysterious than our daily experience suggests. Dreams, after all, are the one place where our minds are completely free to explore territories that logic and physics tell us shouldn't exist. And sometimes, apparently, those territories include tomorrow. Sweet dreams, everyone. And remember, most dreams are just dreams, random neural firings as your brain processes the day's information. But if you happen to have one that feels different, one that feels more real than reality itself, well, maybe pay attention to it. See you in your dreams.